Right now, as you listen to these words, something extraordinary is happening inside your mind. You're not just processing acoustic vibrations or linguistic patterns, you're actually experiencing the sound of language, feeling curiosity or drowsiness, sensing the unique quality of this moment that belongs entirely to you. But here's the question that has haunted philosophers and scientists for decades. Why should there be any experience at all? Welcome to what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness, the deepest mystery in all of human inquiry. In 1995, this Australian philosopher made a distinction that revolutionized how we think about the mind. He separated consciousness research into what he called the easy problems and the hard problem. The easy problems, though incredibly complex, are those we can imagine solving through continued scientific research. How does the brain process information? How do we integrate sensory data? How do we control behavior and attention? But the hard problem is fundamentally different. It's not about what consciousness does, but about why consciousness exists at all. Why is there something it's like to be you? Why isn't your brain just processing information in complete darkness, without any inner light of awareness illuminating the process? Consider the simple act of seeing the color red. When photons with a wavelength of approximately 700 nanometers strike your retina, they trigger a cascade of neural activity. Photoreceptors convert light into electrical signals, which travel through the optic nerve to various brain regions. We can map this entire process with remarkable precision, identifying every neuron that fires, every neurotransmitter released, every brain region activated. Yet nowhere in this chain of physical events do we find the actual experience of redness, that subjective, qualitative sensation that philosophers call a qualia. The redness you experience exists somewhere beyond the reach of our most sophisticated instruments. It's not the wavelength of light, nor the pattern of neural firing, nor any physical process we can measure. It's the subjective feel, the what-it's-likeness of seeing red. This creates what philosophers call the explanatory gap. We can explain the functional aspects of consciousness, how information flows through the brain, how it's processed and integrated, how it influences behavior. But we cannot explain why this processing should give rise to inner experience. There seems to be an unbridgeable chasm between objective, physical processes and subjective, experiential phenomena. Chalmers argues that this isn't merely a temporary limitation of our current scientific methods. Instead, it represents a fundamental challenge to our materialist worldview. Every other mystery in science has eventually yielded to physical explanation. We understood heredity by discovering DNA, explained biological diversity through evolution, and comprehended matter by discovering atoms and fundamental particles. But consciousness appears to resist this reductive approach entirely. The implications are staggering. If consciousness cannot be reduced to physical processes, then either our scientific worldview is incomplete, or consciousness involves something beyond the physical realm. This has led some researchers to propose radical solutions. Perhaps consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, like mass or electric charge. Perhaps our brains don't generate consciousness but rather tune into it like radios receiving broadcasts. Others argue for property dualism, the idea that mental properties are irreducible aspects of reality, not eliminable in favor of physical properties. This doesn't necessarily invoke supernatural explanations, but it does suggest that a complete theory of reality must include psychophysical laws connecting mental and physical phenomena. The hard problem also raises profound questions about artificial intelligence. As we develop increasingly sophisticated machines, how will we know if they're truly conscious or merely philosophical zombies, beings that act conscious but have no inner experience? The external behavioral criteria we use to infer consciousness in other humans become inadequate when we can program machines to exhibit any behavior we desire. Consider the possibility of an entity functionally identical to you in every way, responding to pain, appreciating beauty, claiming to have rich inner experiences, but with no subjective awareness whatsoever. This zombie argument suggests that consciousness is something over and above functional organization. If zombies are even conceivable, it implies that consciousness cannot be reduced to computational processes. The hard problem challenges our most basic assumptions about the nature of reality. If consciousness is fundamental, then the universe is far stranger than our scientific instruments suggest. Every interaction, every measurement, every observation might involve subjective experience at some level. The cosmos might be suffused with consciousness, from the quantum realm to the galactic scale. Yet some philosophers reject the hard problem entirely. Eliminativists like Keith Frankish argue that consciousness, as commonly conceived, is an illusion. There are no qualia, no subjective experiences, just various cognitive processes that create the compelling but false impression of inner awareness. But this view faces an obvious objection. If consciousness is an illusion, what is being fooled? The very capacity to be deceived about consciousness seems to presuppose the reality of subjective experience. The hard problem also intersects with questions of meaning and value. If consciousness is merely an epipheneral byproduct of brain activity, then our subjective experiences, our loves, fears, hopes, and dreams, are ultimately inconsequential. They're just side effects of neural processing, no more significant than the heat generated by a computer. But if consciousness is fundamental, then subjective experience might be the most important aspect of reality. Recent neuroscientific advances have made remarkable progress on the easy problems. We can now read thoughts from brain scans, predict decisions before people are consciously aware of making them, and manipulate specific experiences through precise neural stimulation. Yet these achievements only highlight the persistence of the hard problem. We're becoming increasingly sophisticated at correlating neural activity with reported experiences, but correlation is not explanation. We still don't understand why any of this neural activity should feel like anything from the inside. The hard problem forces us to confront the limits of scientific materialism. Science excels at studying objective, measurable phenomena, but consciousness is inherently subjective. It's known only from the first-person perspective, accessible only to the experiencing subject. This creates a methodological challenge. How can an objective science study subjective phenomena? Some researchers propose that we need new scientific methods designed specifically for consciousness research. Others suggest that consciousness might require its own fundamental laws, irreducible to physics but still scientifically tractable. Still others argue for radical approaches like panpsychism or idealism. The idea that consciousness, not matter, is the fundamental constituent of reality. As we settle into contemplation of these mysteries, consider that the very fact that you can ponder the hard problem demonstrates its reality. Your capacity for subjective experience, for inner questioning and wonder, is the most immediate and certain fact of your existence. Whether this experience can be explained by physical processes or requires expanding our understanding of reality itself remains one of the deepest puzzles facing human inquiry. The hard problem reminds us that despite our scientific sophistication, the nature of our own minds remains profoundly mysterious. In confronting this mystery, we confront the deepest questions about what it means to be conscious beings in an apparently material universe. Picture yourself reaching for a glass of water. Your conscious decision to drink seems to cause your arm to move, yet neuroscience tells us that everything in your body operates according to physical laws. This creates one of philosophy's oldest and most perplexing puzzles. How does the immaterial mind interact with the material body? How can thoughts, which seem to have no physical properties, influence physical matter? This is the mind-body problem, a question that has tormented thinkers since ancient times but received its most famous formulation from René Descartes in the 17th century. Descartes proposed substance dualism, the idea that reality consists of two fundamentally different kinds of substance: mind, residential cogitans, and matter, residential extensa. The mind is non-physical, indivisible, and characterized by thought. The body is physical, divisible, and characterized by extension in space. But if mind and body are so fundamentally different, how do they interact? Descartes himself struggled with this question. He proposed that interaction occurred in the pineal gland, a small structure in the brain that he thought was uniquely suited to serve as the interface between mental and physical realms. But critics immediately pounced on this solution. How can something with no physical properties influence something physical? It's like suggesting that the number 7 could push a rock uphill. This interaction problem has generated centuries of philosophical debate and proposed solutions, each with its own compelling features and serious difficulties. Let's explore the landscape of possible answers to this fundamental question about the nature of human existence. One approach is to deny that interaction is necessary by embracing parallelism or occasionalism. These theories suggest that mind and body don't actually interact but rather run in parallel, like two perfectly synchronized clocks. When you decide to raise your arm, this mental event doesn't cause the physical movement. Instead, both the decision and the movement are synchronized by some external agency. Perhaps God, as Malebranche suggested, or perhaps pre-established harmony as Leibniz proposed. While ingenious, These solutions seem to violate our direct experience of mental causation. We don't feel like our decisions are merely correlated with our actions. We experience ourselves as agents who cause things to happen through conscious will. The parallelism solutions preserve the distinctness of mind and body but at the cost of making mental life causally impotent. Behaviorism attempted to solve the mind-body problem by eliminating one side of the equation. Behaviorists like B.F. Skinner argued that mental states are nothing over and above behavioral dispositions. To be in pain isn't to have some inner experience but to be disposed to cry out, withdraw from stimuli, seek relief, and so forth. This eliminates the interaction problem by denying that there's anything distinctively mental that needs to interact with the physical. But behaviorism faces powerful objections. It seems possible to have mental states without their typical behavioral expressions. You might be in excruciating pain but hide it perfectly, or experience profound joy while maintaining a stoic exterior. Moreover, behaviorism cannot account for the qualitative, subjective aspects of mental life that seem so central to consciousness. The identity theory, developed by philosophers like J.J.C. Smart and U.T. Place, proposed a more sophisticated materialism. Mental states, they argued, are identical to brain states. Pain isn't correlated with C-fiber firing, pain is C-fiber firing, just as water is H2O. This solves the interaction problem by denying any fundamental distinction between mental and physical phenomena. However, the identity theory faces the problem of multiple realizability. Pain seems to be possible in creatures with very different neural architectures. An octopus, a human, and perhaps even a silicon-based alien could all experience pain despite having completely different physical substrates. If pain is identical to some specific type of brain state, how can such diverse physical systems all instantiate the same mental phenomenon? Functionalism emerged as a response to these difficulties. According to functionalists like Jerry Fodor and David Lewis, mental states are defined not by their physical composition but by their functional role, their causal relations to inputs, outputs, and other mental states. Pain is whatever state plays the pain role, being caused by tissue damage, causing withdrawal behaviors, and interacting with beliefs and desires in characteristic ways. Functionalism allows for multiple realizability while maintaining materialism. Pain can be realized in carbon-based brains, silicon computers, or any other physical system that implements the appropriate functional organization. This view has become dominant in cognitive science and artificial intelligence research. Yet functionalism faces its own challenges. The Chinese room argument, which we'll explore in detail later, suggests that functional organization alone cannot account for consciousness and understanding. Moreover, functionalism seems to leave out the qualitative, subjective aspects of mental life. It explains what mental states do but not what they feel like from the inside. Emergentism offers another approach to the mind-body problem. This view suggests that consciousness emerges from complex neural activity in the same way that wetness emerges from H2O molecules or life emerges from complex chemistry. Mental properties are genuinely novel features that arise when physical systems reach sufficient complexity and organization. The appeal of emergentism is that it acknowledges both the dependence of mind on brain and the apparent irreducibility of mental phenomena. Consciousness is natural and scientifically tractable, yet it possesses genuinely novel causal powers. When consciousness emerges, it can influence lower-level physical processes through downward causation. Critics argue that emergence, as typically conceived, is mysterious and perhaps incoherent. How exactly do new causal powers arise from mere complexity? If mental properties are truly novel, how do they fit into the causal closure of physics? The principle that every physical event has a sufficient physical cause? Property dualism, advocated by philosophers like David Chalmers and Frank Jackson, offers a different approach. This view accepts that mental properties are irreducible to physical properties but denies that they constitute a separate substance. Instead, mental and physical properties are different aspects of the same underlying reality. The brain has both physical properties, mass, electrical activity, and mental properties, consciousness, experience. Property dualism avoids the interaction problem by denying substance dualism while preserving the reality of mental phenomena. It suggests that psychophysical laws govern the relationship between mental and physical properties, just as physical laws govern relationships among physical properties. However, property dualism faces questions about mental causation. If mental properties are irreducible to physical properties, how can they influence physical events without violating the causal closure of physics? Some property dualists embrace epiphenomenalism, the view that mental events are caused by physical events but have no causal power themselves. But this makes consciousness a useless appendage with no evolutionary function. Recent developments in neuroscience have provided new perspectives on the mind-body problem. We can now observe the brain in unprecedented detail, correlating specific neural patterns with reported experiences. We can stimulate brain regions and produce specific mental effects, or use brain-computer interfaces to translate thoughts directly into machine commands. These advances support materialist approaches by demonstrating the intimate connection between mind and brain. Every mental phenomenon we study has neural correlates. Damage specific brain regions and specific mental capacities disappear. Alter brain chemistry and mental life changes accordingly. Yet these findings don't definitively resolve the mind-body problem. Correlation isn't causation, and the existence of neural correlates of consciousness doesn't prove that consciousness is nothing over and above neural activity. The relationship between mind and brain remains as puzzling as ever. Quantum mechanics has inspired new approaches to the mind-body problem. Some theorists suggest that quantum indeterminacy provides space for mental causation or that quantum entanglement might explain the unity of consciousness. However, most physicists and philosophers remain skeptical that quantum mechanics solves the mind-body problem. As we contemplate these deep questions about the relationship between mind and body, we're confronting fundamental issues about human nature. Are we purely physical beings whose sense of mental life is ultimately illusory? Are we embodied minds whose consciousness represents something genuinely beyond the physical? Or are we integrated mind-body systems that transcend traditional categories? The mind-body problem remains actively debated because it touches on our deepest concerns about personal identity, free will, and the nature of human existence. How we resolve this problem will shape our understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe. Imagine for a moment that the very atoms making up your body possess some form of rudimentary experience. That every electron harbors a spark of primitive consciousness. Every molecule contains traces of subjective awareness. This isn't science fiction. It's panpsychism, one of the most radical yet increasingly respected approaches to understanding consciousness. According to this view, mind isn't something that emerges only in complex brains but is instead a fundamental feature of reality itself, present at every level of existence. Panpsychism suggests that consciousness is as basic to the universe as mass, charge, or spin. Just as every particle has physical properties, it also has mental properties. Some form of subjective experience, however simple or primitive. This doesn't mean that electrons have rich inner lives filled with hopes and dreams, but rather that they possess the minimal experiential ingredients from which complex consciousness eventually develops. The idea might sound absurd at first, but panpsychism has attracted serious attention from philosophers and scientists grappling with the hard problem of consciousness. If consciousness seems impossible to derive from purely physical processes, perhaps it was there all along, waiting to be organized and amplified by evolutionary processes. Historical precedent for panpsychist thinking extends back to ancient philosophy. Thales, one of the first Greek philosophers, suggested that all things are full of gods. Spinoza argued that every individual thing has some degree of mentality. In the 19th century, philosophers like Gustav Fechner and William James explored panpsychist ideas, with James writing that the universe is alive and whole, and has everywhere some degree of consciousness. Modern panpsychism gained renewed attention through philosophers like Galen Strawson, Philip Goff, and surprisingly, David Chalmers, the very philosopher who articulated the hard problem of consciousness. Their arguments begin with the apparent impossibility of consciousness emerging from purely non-conscious components. How can subjective experience arise from objective processes that contain no experiential elements? The emergence problem, as it's known, suggests that you cannot get something from nothing. Complex systems can exhibit properties that their components lack. Wetness emerges from H2O molecules, life emerges from complex chemistry. But these are cases of weak emergence, where novel properties arise from new organizational relationships. Consciousness seems to require strong emergence, where genuinely novel kinds of properties appear, which many philosophers find mysterious or impossible. Panpsychism sidesteps this problem by distributing consciousness throughout nature. Complex consciousness doesn't emerge from non-conscious matter but rather from the combination and organization of microconscious elements. Your rich inner life results from billions of micro-experiences being unified into a coherent whole, just as the organized movement of individual soldiers creates the coordinated march of an army. But this solution creates its own profound puzzle, the combination problem. How do countless micro-experiences combine to create unified human consciousness? Why don't you experience a cacophony of separate micro-conscious events rather than a single, integrated stream of awareness? This is panpsychism's greatest challenge and most active area of research. Various solutions to the combination problem have been proposed. Some panpsychists suggest that combination occurs through special physical relationships, perhaps when microconscious entities become sufficiently integrated through quantum entanglement or electromagnetic field effects. Others propose that combination is a fundamental psychophysical law, as basic as gravity or electromagnetism. Philip Goff argues for cosmopsychism, the idea that the universe itself is conscious, and individual minds are aspects of cosmic consciousness rather than combinations of microconscious elements. This avoids the combination problem by starting with unified cosmic consciousness and deriving individual minds from it, rather than trying to build up consciousness from microcomponents. Panpsychism takes various forms depending on what kinds of entities are considered conscious. Micropsychism attributes consciousness to fundamental particles. Panprotopsychism suggests that particles have proto-conscious properties that become genuinely conscious only when appropriately combined. Panexperientialism, advocated by process philosophers like Alfred North Whitehead, sees all existence as composed of experiential events rather than material substances. The biological implications of panpsychism are fascinating. If all matter has some degree of consciousness, then the evolution of consciousness becomes continuous with the evolution of complexity. Simple organisms don't suddenly acquire consciousness but rather inherit and organize the microconscious properties already present in their constituent matter. Consciousness isn't something added to biological systems but something that was always there, waiting to be structured and amplified. This view might help explain why consciousness seems so deeply integrated with biological processes. Rather than being an accidental byproduct of neural complexity, consciousness could be the very foundation upon which biological organization builds. Life might be understood as the organization of conscious matter into increasingly sophisticated forms of unified experience. Panpsychism also offers intriguing perspectives on artificial intelligence. If consciousness depends on the right kind of organization of conscious matter, then silicon-based computers might achieve consciousness once they reach appropriate levels of integration. The question wouldn't be whether machines can become conscious but whether we can organize their micro-conscious components into unified experiential systems. However, panpsychism faces serious objections. The combination problem remains largely unsolved despite decades of research. Critics argue that no amount of micro-consciousness could add up to macro-consciousness, just as no amount of micro-witness could add up to macro-witness. The qualitative unity of human consciousness seems categorically different from any conceivable combination of separate experiential elements. Another challenge involves the apparent causal inefficacy of microconsciousness. If electrons have experiences, why don't these experiences affect their behavior? Physics successfully predicts particle behavior without reference to consciousness, suggesting that micro-experiences, if they exist, have no causal power. But causally impotent consciousness seems pointless from an evolutionary perspective. The phenomenological objection questions whether panpsychism can account for the specific character of human consciousness. Our experiences have rich qualitative content. The redness of red, the pain of injury, the joy of discovery. It's unclear how the presumably simple micro-experiences of particles could combine to create such complex phenomenology. Some critics argue that panpsychism merely pushes the mystery back rather than solving it. Instead of asking how consciousness emerges from non-conscious matter, we must ask how unified consciousness emerges from disunified microconsciousness. The fundamental puzzle of consciousness remains unsolved. Nevertheless, panpsychism continues attracting serious philosophical attention because it addresses real problems with materialist approaches to consciousness. If consciousness cannot be reduced to physical processes, and if it cannot emerge from purely non-conscious components, then perhaps it was present all along as a basic feature of reality. Recent developments in physics have provided some support for panpsychist ideas. Quantum mechanics reveals the fundamental role of observation and measurement in physical processes, suggesting deep connections between mind and matter. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics, like the many-minds interpretation, explicitly invoke consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality. Information theory also offers potential support for panpsychism. If consciousness is fundamentally about information integration, and if information is present throughout the physical world, then perhaps consciousness is as well. Integrated information theory, which we'll explore later, suggests that any system that integrates information has some degree of consciousness. The implications of panpsychism extend beyond academic philosophy. If consciousness pervades reality, then ethical considerations might apply to a much wider range of entities than we typically consider. Plants, ecosystems, and perhaps even geological formations might deserve moral consideration if they possess unified conscious experiences. Panpsychism also offers a different perspective on environmental ethics. Rather than seeing nature as mere matter to be exploited, panpsychism suggests that we live in a conscious universe deserving of respect and care. Every natural system potentially harbors forms of experience that should be considered in our moral deliberations. As you contemplate the possibility that consciousness extends throughout reality, consider that this view might resolve the alienation many feel in a supposedly mindless universe. Panpsychism suggests that mind is not a late arrival in cosmic evolution but rather the fundamental nature of existence itself. We are not isolated islands of consciousness in an ocean of dead matter but rather complex expressions of the universe's inherent mentality. Whether panpsychism ultimately proves correct remains to be seen, but it represents a bold attempt to take consciousness seriously as a fundamental feature of reality rather than an anomalous accident of biological evolution. What if consciousness could be measured as precisely as temperature or mass? What if we could assign a numerical value to the consciousness of any system, human, animal, or machine, and determine exactly which entities in the universe possess subjective experience? This ambitious vision drives integrated information theory, or IIT, one of the most mathematically sophisticated attempts to understand consciousness scientifically. Developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, IIT proposes that consciousness corresponds to integrated information that is unified and cannot be reduced to independent parts. According to this theory, any system that integrates information has some degree of consciousness, and the amount of consciousness can be calculated using mathematical principles. The core insight of IIT begins with phenomenology, the careful examination of conscious experience itself. When you look around right now, you don't experience separate patches of color, distinct sounds, and isolated tactile sensations. Instead, you experience a unified conscious scene that integrates all these elements into a coherent whole. This unity isn't just convenient. According to IIT, it's the essence of consciousness itself. IIT formalizes this insight through the concept of integrated information, represented by the Greek letter phi. Phi measures how much information is generated by a system above and beyond the sum of its parts. A system with high phi integrates information in ways that cannot be reduced to the separate activities of its components. A system with zero phi has no integrated information and therefore no consciousness. To understand integrated information, consider the difference between your unified visual experience and a collection of separate photodetectors. When you see a red ball on a green field, you don't just detect redness and greenness separately. Your visual system integrates this information to create the unified experience of a red object against a green background. The integrated information is greater than the sum of the separate color detections. The mathematical formulation of IIT involves calculating phi for any given system by examining all possible ways the system could be partitioned and determining how much information would be lost if those partitions were actually implemented. Systems that lose significant information when partitioned have high integration and therefore high consciousness. This approach yields surprising predictions. According to IIT, consciousness is not limited to biological brains but can arise in any appropriately organized information processing system. A sophisticated computer network might be conscious if it integrates information appropriately. Even simple systems like photodiodes connected in the right configuration could possess minimal consciousness. More counterintuitively, IIT suggests that some systems we don't typically consider conscious might actually have higher phi values than human brains. A vast network of interconnected sensors might integrate information more effectively than biological neural networks, making it more conscious despite lacking any obvious signs of awareness. The theory also makes specific predictions about the neural basis of consciousness in humans. According to IIT, consciousness doesn't depend on specific brain regions but rather on the integration of information across neural networks. The thalamocortical system, which connects the thalamus to the cerebral cortex, seems particularly important for consciousness because it creates highly integrated information processing loops. IIT helps explain various puzzling features of consciousness. The theory predicts that consciousness fades during dreamless sleep not because neural activity decreases but because information integration is reduced. General anesthetics work by disrupting integrated information processing rather than simply reducing overall brain activity. Split-brain patients whose corpus callosum has been severed might have divided consciousness because information integration between brain hemispheres is impaired. The theory also addresses the binding problem, how the brain combines separate sensory inputs into unified conscious experiences. According to IIT, binding occurs naturally when information from different sources becomes integrated within conscious systems. The unified nature of consciousness reflects the integrated nature of the underlying information processing. One of IIT's most ambitious claims involves the relationship between consciousness and information. The theory suggests that conscious experiences are identical to integrated information structures called conceptual structures, or Qualia spaces. Every possible conscious experience corresponds to a specific mathematical object that could, in principle, be calculated and characterized completely. This mathematical approach to consciousness offers the possibility of truly scientific consciousness research. Rather than relying on subjective reports or behavioral inferences, IIT proposes that consciousness can be measured objectively using information-theoretic principles. We could theoretically scan any system, calculate its phi value, and determine exactly how conscious it is. However, IIT faces significant challenges and criticisms. The calculation of phi is computationally intensive, making it practically impossible to compute for complex systems like human brains. Current implementations of IIT can only handle very simple networks, limiting the theory's empirical testability. The theory also leads to counterintuitive conclusions that many find implausible. Simple systems like photodiode networks might have higher phi values than human brains, suggesting they are more conscious than people. This seems to conflict with our intuitive understanding of consciousness as requiring sophisticated cognitive abilities. Critics argue that IIT conflates information processing with consciousness. Just because a system integrates information doesn't necessarily mean it has subjective experiences. The theory might be measuring computational complexity rather than genuine consciousness, missing the hard problem of why information integration should feel like anything from the inside. The unfolding argument presents another challenge. According to IIT, any system that can be described as integrating information is conscious to some degree. This leads to conclusions that strike many as absurd. Collections of disconnected systems might be conscious if they can be mathematically described as integrated wholes. Even the United States might be conscious if we consider citizens as information processing nodes in a larger network. Despite these challenges, IIT has generated significant empirical research. Scientists have used measures derived from IIT to study consciousness in various conditions. The Perturbational Complexity Index, PCI, based on IIT principles, can distinguish conscious from unconscious states by measuring how complex responses to magnetic stimulation become integrated across the brain. Studies using PCI have provided insights into various altered states of consciousness. Anesthetized patients show reduced PCI values, while patients in vegetative states have PCI values intermediate between conscious and unconscious conditions. Some patients diagnosed as vegetative actually show PCI values suggesting retained consciousness, potentially revolutionizing how we understand and treat disorders of consciousness. IIT has also influenced artificial intelligence research. If consciousness really depends on integrated information processing, then creating conscious machines requires designing systems that integrate information appropriately rather than simply processing it efficiently. This might require architectural principles quite different from current AI systems, which typically emphasize parallel processing over integration. The theory raises profound questions about the distribution of consciousness in nature. If integration of information is sufficient for consciousness, then consciousness might be far more widespread than typically assumed. Ecosystems that integrate information about environmental conditions might possess forms of collective consciousness. Even geological systems that integrate information over long timescales might have extended conscious experiences. Recent developments in IIT have attempted to address some criticisms while extending the theory's scope. IIT 3.0, the current version, provides more sophisticated mathematical tools for calculating integrated information and addresses some previous counterintuitive conclusions. However, fundamental questions about the theory's relationship to subjective experience remain unresolved. The implications of IIT extend beyond consciousness research to ethics and moral philosophy. If consciousness can be measured objectively, we could make principled decisions about the moral status of various entities. Animals, artificial systems, and even collective entities might deserve moral consideration based on their 5 values rather than their resemblance to humans. As research continues, IIT represents one of the most ambitious attempts to bridge the gap between subjective experience and objective science. Whether consciousness really can be captured by mathematical measures of information integration remains an open question, but IIT has already transformed how many researchers approach the study of consciousness. The theory suggests that consciousness might be far more fundamental and widespread than we typically assume, potentially present wherever information becomes appropriately integrated. As you contemplate your own unified conscious experience, consider that according to IIT, you are literally made of integrated information, not just processing it but embodying it as the very substance of your conscious awareness. Imagine your brain as a vast theater with thousands of specialized processors working behind the scenes. Some analyzing visual patterns, others processing sounds, still others managing memories and emotions. Most of this work happens in darkness, outside the spotlight of consciousness. But occasionally, information steps onto the brightly lit stage where it becomes globally available to all the brain systems. This is the central metaphor of global workspace theory, one of the most influential frameworks for understanding how consciousness emerges from neural activity. Developed by cognitive scientist Bernard Baars in the 1980s and later refined by Stanislas Dehaene and others, global workspace theory (GWT) proposes that consciousness serves as a global broadcasting system in the brain. Unconscious processes compete for access to a limited capacity workspace, and information that gains access becomes conscious by being broadcast widely throughout the brain. The theory begins with a simple observation. Your brain processes vast amounts of information, but only a tiny fraction reaches consciousness at any given moment. Right now, your visual system is analyzing thousands of details about your environment, your auditory system is processing ambient sounds, and your somatosensory system is monitoring bodily sensations. Yet you're consciously aware of only a small subset of this information. Perhaps the words you're hearing, a particular visual object you're attending to, or a specific physical sensation. GWT explains this selectivity through the concept of competitive selection. Unconscious neural processes compete for access to the global workspace like politicians competing for media attention. The most relevant, novel, or emotionally significant information wins this competition and gains access to consciousness by being broadcast throughout the brain. Once information enters the global workspace, it becomes available to multiple brain systems simultaneously. Memory systems can store it, planning systems can use it for decision-making, and motor systems can act upon it. This global availability is what distinguishes conscious from unconscious processing. Unconscious processes are locally efficient but globally isolated, while conscious processes are globally connected but capacity limited. The theater metaphor captures this dynamic perfectly. Behind the scenes, numerous specialized systems work on specific tasks: scene analysis, face recognition, language processing, emotional evaluation. Most of this work remains unconscious, like stagehands preparing for a performance. But when information becomes conscious, it's like an actor stepping into the spotlight, becoming visible to the entire audience of brain systems. Modern neuroscience has provided substantial support for GWT through discoveries about neural connectivity and information flow. The brain exhibits a hierarchical organization where local neural circuits process specific types of information, while long-range connections integrate information across regions. Consciousness appears to depend critically on these long-range connections that enable global broadcasting. Neuroimaging studies reveal the neural signatures of global broadcasting. When information becomes conscious, there's a characteristic pattern of brain activation called the P3, or late positive component, that occurs about 300 to 500 milliseconds after stimulus presentation. This neural signature reflects the global ignition of widespread brain networks, exactly as GWT predicts. Studies of patients with brain lesions support GWT's predictions about the neural basis of consciousness. Damage to areas involved in global connectivity, such as the thalamus, which serves as a relay station for information flow, can severely impair consciousness while leaving specialized functions intact. Patients might retain the ability to process visual information unconsciously while losing conscious visual awareness. The theory also explains various puzzling features of consciousness. Change blindness. The failure to notice large changes in visual scenes occurs because unchanged information doesn't compete successfully for workspace access. Inattentional blindness, missing obvious stimuli when attention is focused elsewhere, happens because the global workspace is already occupied by attended information. Binocular rivalry provides another compelling demonstration of workspace dynamics. When different images are presented to each eye, consciousness alternates between them rather than blending them together. This suggests that the global workspace can only broadcast one coherent interpretation at a time, consistent with its limited capacity. The global neuronal workspace, developed by Stanislas Dehaene, provides a more detailed neural implementation of GWT. This theory identifies specific brain networks involved in global broadcasting, particularly the frontoparietal network that connects prefrontal and parietal cortices. These regions have extensive connections throughout the brain, making them ideal candidates for global workspace functions. Research on this network has revealed fascinating details about how information becomes conscious. Initially, sensory information is processed locally in specialized brain regions. If this information is relevant enough to gain workspace access, it triggers a sudden ignition of the frontoparietal network, broadcasting the information globally. This ignition is accompanied by high-frequency neural oscillations that may facilitate information sharing across distant brain regions. The theory makes specific predictions about altered states of consciousness. General anesthesia should disrupt global connectivity while preserving local processing, which is exactly what neuroimaging studies have found. Anesthetized patients show reduced long-range connectivity while maintaining local neural activity, consistent with the loss of global broadcasting. Sleep provides another testing ground for GWT. During REM sleep, when vivid dreams occur, global connectivity remains relatively intact, allowing for complex conscious experiences. During deep sleep, global connectivity is severely reduced, corresponding to the absence of reportable conscious content. This supports the idea that consciousness depends on global information sharing rather than overall neural activity levels. GWT also offers insights into psychiatric and neurological conditions. Schizophrenia might involve dysregulation of the global workspace, leading to inappropriate access of irrelevant information to consciousness. Depression might reflect biased competition where negative information consistently wins access to the workspace. Attention deficit disorders might stem from difficulty maintaining information in the global workspace. The theory has important implications for artificial intelligence. If consciousness emerges from global broadcasting, then creating conscious machines requires designing architectures that can globally share information among specialized processing modules. Current AI systems typically lack this kind of global integration, instead using specialized networks for specific tasks without systematic information sharing. However, GWT faces several challenges and limitations. The theory explains how information becomes globally available but doesn't address why global availability should be accompanied by subjective experience. This is a version of the hard problem of consciousness. Even if we understand the mechanisms of global broadcasting, we still don't understand why there should be something it's like to have information in the global workspace. Critics argue that GWT conflates access consciousness, the ability to use information for reasoning and reporting, with phenomenal consciousness, the subjective feel of experience. The theory might explain how information becomes accessible to multiple brain systems without explaining why this accessibility is accompanied by inner experience. The workspace metaphor, while intuitive, might also be misleading. Real theaters have audiences that observe what happens on stage, but GWT doesn't specify what observes the contents of the global workspace. This leads to potential regress problems: who watches the watcher? Another challenge involves the unity of consciousness. While GWT explains how different types of information can become globally available, it's less clear how this creates the unified conscious experience we actually have. Why don't we experience separate broadcasts from different brain systems rather than a single, integrated conscious state? Recent developments in GWT have attempted to address some of these concerns. The theory now emphasizes that consciousness isn't just about broadcasting but about the specific ways information becomes integrated and accessible. Different types of global access might create different qualities of conscious experience. Research on the neural correlates of consciousness has revealed that global broadcasting involves multiple stages and mechanisms. Initial sensory processing occurs unconsciously in specialized regions. If information passes certain thresholds for relevance and salience, it triggers a cascade of neural events that culminate in global ignition. This process involves both bottom-up signals from sensory regions and top-down signals from attention and control networks. The timing of these processes provides crucial insights into consciousness. The first 200 milliseconds of processing typically occur unconsciously, even for stimuli that will eventually become conscious. Global ignition begins around 300 milliseconds and creates the characteristic neural signatures of conscious access. This timing suggests that consciousness is not immediate but requires time for global broadcasting to unfold. Interestingly, some information can influence behavior without ever gaining workspace access. Subliminal priming studies show that unconsciously processed information can affect decisions and actions, even though it never reaches the global workspace. This supports GWT's distinction between unconscious local processing and conscious global broadcasting. The theory also helps explain individual differences in consciousness. People vary in the strength and efficiency of their global connectivity, which might contribute to differences in conscious experience. Some individuals might have more vivid and detailed conscious experiences due to more effective global broadcasting, while others might have more fragmented or limited conscious access. Cultural and developmental factors might also influence global workspace function. Learning and experience shape the neural connections that enable global broadcasting, potentially affecting what types of information can access consciousness and how readily they do so. This suggests that consciousness itself might be partially learned and culturally shaped. As neurotechnology advances, GWT provides a framework for understanding and potentially manipulating consciousness. Brain stimulation techniques might be able to enhance or disrupt global broadcasting, offering new treatments for disorders of consciousness. Brain-computer interfaces might tap into the global workspace to decode conscious intentions more effectively than current systems. The theory raises fascinating questions about the evolution of consciousness. Why did global broadcasting evolve? GWT suggests that consciousness provides adaptive advantages by enabling flexible, context-sensitive responses to novel situations. Global broadcasting allows the brain to bring together information from multiple specialized systems to generate creative solutions to complex problems. This evolutionary perspective suggests that consciousness isn't an accident but serves important functional roles. The global workspace enables abstract reasoning, long-term planning, and creative problem-solving that would be impossible with purely local processing. It also enables communication and social coordination by providing a common format for sharing information between individuals. Recent research has begun exploring how the global workspace develops in children and how it might differ across species. Young children show gradual development of global connectivity, corresponding to increases in conscious access and cognitive flexibility. Other species might have global workspaces with different characteristics, potentially creating different forms of conscious experience. The implications of GWT extend beyond neuroscience to philosophy and ethics. If consciousness depends on global broadcasting, then the moral status of different entities might depend on their capacity for global information integration. This provides a potential criterion for consciousness that could apply to animals, artificial systems, and even collective entities. As you contemplate your current conscious experience, consider that according to GWT, you're experiencing the contents of your brain's global workspace, information that has won the competition for global access and is now being broadcast throughout your neural networks. The words you're hearing, the thoughts you're thinking, and the feelings you're experiencing all reflect this ongoing process of global information sharing. The theory suggests that consciousness isn't a thing but a process, the dynamic broadcasting of information that enables flexible, adaptive responses to the world. Your conscious self might be better understood as a global communication system rather than a unified entity, constantly updating and broadcasting information to coordinate the activities of your many neural subsystems. Imagine you're locked in a room with an enormous book of rules written in English. People outside the room pass you cards with Chinese characters written on them, and you use the rule book to manipulate these symbols, selecting appropriate Chinese characters to pass back out. From the outside, it appears you understand Chinese perfectly. You're giving coherent, contextually appropriate responses to Chinese questions. But you don't understand a word of Chinese. You're simply following mechanical rules for symbol manipulation. This thought experiment, known as the Chinese Room, has sparked decades of debate about artificial intelligence, consciousness, and the nature of understanding itself. Created by philosopher John Searle in 1980, the Chinese Room argument targets the central assumption of artificial intelligence research, that appropriately programmed computers can literally think, understand, and be conscious. Searle argues that no matter how sophisticated a computer program becomes, it can never achieve genuine understanding because it's fundamentally limited to manipulating symbols according to formal rules, without any comprehension of what those symbols mean. The argument unfolds in several stages, each designed to show that syntax, the manipulation of symbols according to rules, can never be sufficient for semantics, actual meaning, and understanding. Searle begins with the observation that computer programs are purely syntactic. They manipulate symbols based on their formal properties, not their meanings. A computer doesn't know that the symbol 2 refers to the number 2. It simply processes this symbol according to programmed rules. Now consider a computer program that passes the Turing test by engaging in convincing conversations with humans. According to the strong AI thesis, such a program would literally understand language and possess genuine intelligence. But Searle argues that the Chinese Room scenario shows this conclusion is false. The person in the room produces appropriate Chinese responses without understanding Chinese, so why should we think a computer program understands language just because it produces appropriate responses? The force of this argument lies in its intuitive appeal. When you understand something, there's a qualitative, subjective experience of comprehension. Meanings feel meaningful to you. But the Chinese Room operator has no such experience with Chinese characters. They remain meaningless symbols manipulated according to mechanical rules. Similarly, Searle argues, computer programs can manipulate linguistic symbols without experiencing their meanings. Searle strengthens his argument by considering various objections and responses. The system's reply suggests that while the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese, the entire system, person, room, rulebook, does understand Chinese. Searle responds by imagining the person memorizing all the rules and performing the computations in their head. Now the entire system is contained within one person who still doesn't understand Chinese. The robot reply proposes that understanding might emerge if the computer program controlled a robot that could interact with the physical world. Searle responds by imagining the Chinese Room inside the robot's head, controlling its actions. The person manipulates Chinese symbols to produce appropriate motor outputs, but still doesn't understand what the symbols mean or what the robot is doing. The brain simulator reply suggests that a program simulating neural activity at the level of individual neurons might achieve understanding. Searle responds by imagining people simulating each neuron by hand, following rules for when to signal other neurons. This vast network of people could theoretically simulate a brain, but none of them would understand what the brain supposedly understands. These responses reveal the argument's central insight. Formal symbol manipulation, no matter how complex or sophisticated, cannot generate genuine meaning and understanding. Understanding requires what Searle calls intrinsic intentionality, the capacity for mental states to be genuinely about things in the world. Computer programs have only derived intentionality. Their symbols have meaning only because we interpret them as meaningful. The Chinese Room argument has profound implications for artificial intelligence research. If Searle is correct, then the entire project of creating genuinely intelligent machines through programming is fundamentally misguided. No matter how sophisticated our algorithms become, they will remain sophisticated symbol manipulators rather than genuine minds. This doesn't mean computers can't be useful or even appear intelligent. They can process information, solve problems, and generate human-like responses with increasing sophistication. But according to Searle, they can never achieve genuine understanding, consciousness, or intelligence in the way humans do. The argument also challenges functionalist theories of mind, which hold that mental states are defined by their functional roles rather than their physical implementation. If the Chinese Room can duplicate the functional behavior of understanding without actually understanding, then functional behavior isn't sufficient for mentality. However, the Chinese Room argument has faced numerous criticisms and counterarguments. Some philosophers argue that the intuitions driving the argument are unreliable. Our everyday concept of understanding might not apply straightforwardly to artificial systems, especially those with architectures very different from human brains. The speed and complexity objection suggests that genuine understanding might emerge when symbol manipulation occurs at sufficient speed and complexity. Current computers are far too slow and simple compared to human brains. A computer program running at the speed of thought with the complexity of a human brain might genuinely understand, even if simpler systems don't. Others argue that Searle's thought experiment illegitimately restricts our attention to one component of a complex system. The person in the Chinese room doesn't understand Chinese, but this no more proves the system doesn't understand than pointing to a single neuron's lack of understanding proves brains don't understand. The connectionist reply suggests that understanding might emerge from the right kind of parallel processing network rather than serial symbol manipulation. Modern neural networks learn to recognize patterns and generate responses through training rather than explicit programming. These systems might achieve understanding through mechanisms quite different from the rule-based manipulation Searle envisions. Recent developments in artificial intelligence have renewed interest in the Chinese room argument. Large language models like GPT can generate remarkably human-like text, engage in sophisticated conversations, and even appear to reason about complex topics. Do these systems genuinely understand language, or are they sophisticated Chinese rooms manipulating linguistic symbols without comprehension? Proponents of the Chinese room argument point out that these systems are trained to predict the next word in sequences of text, which seems like pure symbol manipulation. No matter how sophisticated their responses, they're fundamentally performing statistical pattern matching on linguistic symbols without genuine understanding of meaning. Critics argue that understanding might be nothing more than sophisticated pattern recognition and response generation. If a system can engage with language flexibly, answer questions appropriately, and adapt to new contexts, what more could understanding involve? The requirement for some additional, mysterious quality of genuine understanding might be based on outdated intuitions about the nature of mind. The argument also raises questions about consciousness and subjective experience. Even if computers could achieve understanding, would they have conscious experiences accompanying that understanding? Searle argues that consciousness depends on specific biological features of brains that computers lack. Silicon chips cannot generate the kind of neurochemical activity that creates consciousness in biological brains. This position, known as biological naturalism, suggests that consciousness is a higher-level feature of brain activity, like digestion is a higher-level feature of stomach activity. Just as a computer simulation of digestion cannot actually digest food, a computer simulation of consciousness cannot actually be conscious. However, this biological restriction seems arbitrary to many critics. If consciousness depends on information processing patterns rather than specific biological materials, then artificial systems with the right patterns might be conscious regardless of their physical substrate. The specific chemistry of biological brains might be irrelevant to consciousness. The Chinese room argument intersects with broader questions about the nature of meaning and interpretation. How do words and symbols acquire meaning? Humans presumably understand language because our words refer to things in the world and express our thoughts and experiences. But how this semantic relationship between symbols and meanings is established remains deeply mysterious. Some philosophers argue that meaning depends on the entire network of relationships between symbols, experiences, and actions. Understanding emerges from being embedded in this network rather than from internal mental states. If so, sufficiently embedded artificial systems might achieve genuine understanding even if they begin as mere symbol manipulators. The argument also raises questions about other minds. How do we know that other humans genuinely understand rather than just producing appropriate linguistic responses? The Chinese room suggests we might be surrounded by philosophical zombies who behave intelligently without inner understanding. This skeptical possibility highlights the difficulty of determining genuine understanding from external behavior alone. As artificial intelligence systems become increasingly sophisticated, the Chinese room argument forces us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of mind, meaning, and understanding. Are we genuinely intelligent beings with inner lives, or are we biological computers manipulating neural symbols according to evolved rules? The answer to this question will shape how we understand ourselves and our relationship to the artificial minds we're creating. Whether the Chinese room argument ultimately succeeds in showing the limitations of artificial intelligence remains hotly debated. But it has undeniably enriched our understanding of what genuine intelligence and understanding might involve, forcing researchers to grapple with deep questions about the nature of mind that might otherwise be overlooked in the rush to create intelligent machines. Close your eyes and imagine biting into a perfectly ripe strawberry. The explosion of sweetness, the particular texture against your tongue, the rich red color filling your mind's eye, these qualitative aspects of experience, These subjective fields that make up the fabric of your conscious life are what philosophers call qualia. They represent perhaps the most intimate and immediate aspects of consciousness, yet they pose one of the deepest puzzles in our understanding of mind and reality. Qualia are the subjective, experiential qualities of conscious states. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the sadness of melancholy. They're the what it's like aspects of experience that seem to resist objective description. You can describe the wavelength of red light, approximately 700 nanometers, map the neural circuits activated by seeing red, and catalog behavioral responses to red stimuli. But none of these objective descriptions capture the subjective quality of redness as you experience it. This creates what philosopher David Chalmers calls the phenomenal concept strategy. Our concepts of qualitative experience seem fundamentally different from our concepts of physical processes. When you think about pain, you're not just thinking about nociceptor activation or withdrawal behaviors. You're thinking about the specific, subjective feel of pain that can only be known through direct experience. The puzzle of qualia intersects with fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical world. If qualia are real features of experience, how do they relate to brain states? Are they identical to neural processes, emergent properties of complex systems, or something else entirely? Materialist philosophers attempt to reduce qualia to physical processes. According to this view, the redness you experience when seeing a red rose is nothing over and above specific patterns of neural activity in your visual cortex. The qualitative feel of redness is just how certain brain states feel from the inside. There's no mysterious additional property beyond the physical processes themselves. But this reductive approach faces the knowledge argument developed by philosopher Frank Jackson. Consider Mary, a brilliant scientist who knows everything there is to know about color from a physical perspective. She understands wavelengths, knows how the eye processes light, can predict exactly how people will react to different colors. But Mary has been locked in a black and white room her entire life and has never actually seen color. The crucial question: when Mary finally leaves her room and sees a red apple for the first time, does she learn something new? Most people intuitively say yes, she learns what it's like to see red. She acquires knowledge of the qualia of redness that she couldn't possess through purely physical knowledge. If Mary learns something new, this suggests qualia involve non-physical properties that can't be captured by physical science. Defenders of physicalism offer various responses to the knowledge argument. Some argue that Mary doesn't learn new facts but rather acquires new ways of accessing facts she already knew. Others suggest that Mary gains new abilities, like recognizing colors, rather than new knowledge. Still others argue that the thought experiment is impossible because someone with complete physical knowledge would necessarily have color experiences. The inverted spectrum scenario presents another challenge for understanding qualia. Imagine that from birth, your color experiences have been systematically inverted relative to everyone else's. When you look at a strawberry, you have the experience others have when looking at grass and vice versa. But you've learned to call strawberries red and grass green, just like everyone else. This scenario seems perfectly coherent. There's no behavioral test that could detect such systematic inversion. Yet if qualia are real, there would be a genuine difference between your experiences and others, even though this difference could never be detected externally. This suggests qualia are intrinsic features of experience that can vary independently of functional or behavioral properties. Some philosophers argue that inverted spectra are impossible because color experiences are too tightly connected to other aspects of experience and behavior. Red might be essentially associated with warmth, excitement, and danger in ways that make systematic inversion conceptually incoherent. But others maintain that the logical possibility of inversion shows that qualia are real and irreducible. The problem of absent qualia pushes these issues even further. Could there be beings functionally identical to you, responding to pain, appreciating beauty, engaging in complex reasoning, but with no subjective experiences whatsoever? These philosophical zombies would behave exactly like conscious beings but lack inner qualitative experience. If zombies are possible, it suggests qualia are something over and above functional organization. If they're impossible, it suggests consciousness is entirely captured by functional relationships. The debate over zombie possibility has generated enormous philosophical literature, with arguments on both sides becoming increasingly sophisticated. Recent developments in neuroscience have provided new perspectives on qualia. We can now observe neural correlates of specific qualitative experiences with unprecedented precision. Different colors, tastes, and emotions have distinctive neural signatures that can be detected through brain imaging. We can even decode some experiences directly from brain activity. These findings support physicalist approaches by demonstrating tight correlations between subjective experiences and neural processes. Alter the brain in specific ways and qualitative experiences change predictably. Stimulate certain brain regions and subjects report specific qualia. This suggests qualia are intimately connected to physical processes, even if the nature of this connection remains mysterious. However, correlation isn't causation, and the existence of neural correlates doesn't prove that qualia are identical to neural processes. The hard problem of consciousness remains: why should any of this neural activity be accompanied by subjective experience? Even perfect knowledge of neural correlates might not explain why there's something it's like to have those brain states. Philosophers have proposed various approaches to understanding qualia. Representationalism suggests that qualia are exhausted by the representational content of experiences. When you see red, the qualitative redness just is the representation of a certain surface property. This approach attempts to reduce qualia to representational relationships rather than intrinsic properties. But representationalism faces the problem of spectrum inversion and other cases where representational content seems separable from qualitative feel. It also struggles with experiences that seem purely qualitative without obvious representational content, like undifferentiated feelings of anxiety or contentment. Higher-order thought theories propose that qualia emerge when we have thoughts about our mental states. The redness you experience when seeing red results from higher-order thoughts about your visual states. This approach attempts to explain qualia through cognitive architecture rather than special qualitative properties. Critics argue that higher-order theories get the phenomenology wrong. Qualia seem to be features of our experiences themselves, not thoughts about those experiences. Moreover, the theory seems to generate infinite regress. If qualia require higher-order thoughts, what about the qualia of those thoughts? Illusionist approaches, defended by philosophers like Keith Frankish and Dennett, argue that qualia don't exist as commonly conceived. What we call qualia are actually judgments about our experiences rather than intrinsic properties. The feeling that experiences have ineffable qualitative properties results from the way our introspective mechanisms work, not from genuine qualitative features. But illusionism faces the obvious objection that it denies what seems most obvious about consciousness: its qualitative nature. If someone argues that pain doesn't really hurt in the way it seems to, this appears to misunderstand or dismiss the very phenomenon we're trying to explain. Panpsychist approaches suggest that qualia are fundamental features of reality present at all levels of existence. Your rich qualitative experiences result from the combination of microqualia possessed by the particles making up your brain. This avoids the emergence problem by making qualia basic rather than emergent. However, panpsychism faces the combination problem. How do microqualia combine to create unified human experiences? It also seems to multiply mysteries rather than solve them by attributing experience to entities that show no signs of consciousness. The study of qualia intersects with practical questions about artificial intelligence and animal consciousness. If qualia are real and irreducible, how could we determine whether machines or animals possess them? Behavioral and functional criteria seem inadequate if qualia can vary independently of function. Some researchers propose that we need new scientific methods designed specifically for studying subjective experience. First-person methodologies might complement third-person neuroscience by providing systematic ways to investigate the structure of qualitative experience. Contemplative traditions offer sophisticated techniques for examining consciousness that might inform scientific research. The question of qualia also bears on ethics and moral consideration. If qualia are what make experiences matter morally, then determining which entities possess qualia becomes crucial for ethical theory. The capacity for suffering, which seems intimately connected to qualitative experience, is often taken as the basis for moral consideration. As you reflect on your current experiences, the qualities of light, sound, and sensation that make up this moment, consider that you're confronting one of the deepest mysteries of existence. These qualia that seem so immediate and obvious to you remain among the most puzzling phenomena in all of science and philosophy. Whether qualia can ultimately be explained through physical processes, require expanding our understanding of reality, or represent illusions created by introspective mechanisms remains hotly debated. But their apparent reality and seeming irreducibility continue to challenge our understanding of consciousness and its place in the natural world. The mystery of Qualia reminds us that despite our scientific sophistication, the most intimate and immediate aspects of our own experience remain profoundly puzzling. In confronting Qualia, we confront the mystery of what it means to be conscious beings in an apparently physical universe. Picture a brilliant scientist named Mary who has spent her entire life in a black and white room, experiencing the world only through black and white monitors. Despite this limitation, Mary has become the world's leading expert on the physical facts about color. She knows everything about wavelengths of light, how the human eye processes different frequencies, how the brain responds to various visual stimuli, and how people typically react to different colors. She can predict with perfect accuracy how someone will respond to seeing a red rose or a blue sky. But Mary has never actually experienced color herself. Until today, when she's finally released from her room and sees a red apple for the first time. The question that has captivated philosophers for decades is simple yet profound. Does Mary learn something new? This thought experiment, known as Mary's Room or the knowledge argument, was created by philosopher Frank Jackson in 1982 to challenge physicalist theories of consciousness. Jackson argued that if Mary learns something new upon seeing red for the first time, and most people intuitively believe she does, then there are truths about consciousness that cannot be captured by physical knowledge alone. The argument proceeds through several carefully constructed steps. First, we establish that Mary knows all physical facts about color before her release. This isn't just general knowledge about physics and neuroscience, but complete physical knowledge. Every fact that could in principle be stated in the language of physical science. She knows the exact wavelength of red light, approximately 700 nanometers, the precise neural firing patterns associated with red experiences, the evolutionary history of color vision, and the complete causal chains linking red objects to red experiences. Second, we assume that upon seeing red for the first time, Mary learns something new. She discovers what it's like to see red, acquiring knowledge she couldn't possess through purely physical information. This new knowledge concerns what philosophers call phenomenal properties, or qualia, the subjective, experiential aspects of conscious states. From these premises, Jackson concluded that there are truths about consciousness, facts about what experiences are like, that aren't physical truths. If physicalism were correct, complete physical knowledge would be complete knowledge simpliciter. But Mary's case suggests there are non-physical facts about consciousness that escape physical description. The intuitive appeal of this argument is enormous. When we imagine Mary's situation, it seems obvious that seeing red for the first time would teach her something no amount of physical knowledge could convey. There's something about the qualitative nature of color experience that seems to resist capture by objective, scientific description. This intuition points to a fundamental asymmetry between first-person and third-person knowledge of consciousness. You know what your own experiences are like in a way that others cannot, no matter how complete their objective knowledge of your brain states. Similarly, Mary's first-person knowledge of color experience provides something that all her third-person physical knowledge couldn't deliver. However, the knowledge argument has faced sophisticated objections since its introduction. Physicalists have developed several strategies for resisting Jackson's conclusion while preserving their commitment to the physical nature of consciousness. The ability hypothesis, developed by David Lewis and Lawrence Nemiro, argues that Mary doesn't learn new facts but rather acquires new abilities. When she sees red for the first time, she gains the ability to recognize red, imagine red, and remember red experiences. These are new ways of accessing information she already possessed, not new information itself. According to this view, Mary's pre-release knowledge of red included all the facts about red experiences, but she lacked certain ways of accessing these facts. The phenomenal concept of red, the concept she acquires through direct experience, provides a new mode of presentation for facts she already knew under physical descriptions. Critics of the ability hypothesis argue that it doesn't capture what seems most important about Mary's new knowledge. When Mary sees red, she seems to discover something about the nature of red experiences, not just acquire new abilities. The qualitative nature of redness appears to be a genuine feature of reality that Mary learns about, not merely a new way of accessing old information. The phenomenal concept strategy offers a more nuanced physicalist response. Developed by philosophers like Brian Lohr and David Papineau, this approach acknowledges that Mary acquires genuinely new concepts when she sees red, but argues that these concepts refer to the same physical properties she already knew about under different descriptions. Phenomenal concepts are special because they're constituted by the very experiences they represent. When you think about pain using your phenomenal concept of pain, this concept is partially constituted by pain experiences themselves. This gives phenomenal concepts a unique cognitive role that explains why Mary's new color concepts seem to provide new knowledge even though they refer to physical properties she already knew about. However, critics argue that the phenomenal concept strategy doesn't fully explain the apparent novelty of Mary's post-release knowledge. If her new concepts refer to the same properties as her old concepts, why does gaining them feel like such a significant discovery? The strategy might explain the mechanism by which Mary acquires new concepts without explaining why this acquisition seems revelatory. Some philosophers have questioned whether Mary's situation is coherent as described. If Mary truly knew all physical facts about color, wouldn't this knowledge necessarily include color experiences? Complete physical knowledge might require understanding all the causal relations involving color experiences, which could necessitate having such experiences. Daniel Dennett has argued that genuinely complete physical knowledge would be so vast and detailed that it would necessarily involve having the relevant experiences. A being with truly complete physical knowledge about color would, in effect, be implementing color experiences and thus couldn't lack phenomenal knowledge of color. Others question whether the thought experiment's intuitions are reliable. Our folk psychological concepts might not apply straightforwardly to cases as extreme as Mary's. The intuition that Mary learns something new might reflect limitations in our conceptual frameworks rather than genuine metaphysical insights. Recent developments in neuroscience have provided new perspectives on the knowledge argument. We can now observe neural correlates of color experiences with remarkable precision and even decode color experiences from brain activity. If these correlations are tight enough, it might undermine the intuition that phenomenal knowledge is separate from physical knowledge. However, correlation is an identity, and even perfect neural correlates might not eliminate the explanatory gap that motivates the knowledge argument. Knowing that specific neural patterns correlate with red experiences doesn't necessarily explain why those patterns should be accompanied by the subjective quality of redness. The debate over Mary's room connects to broader questions about the nature of consciousness and its place in the physical world. If consciousness involves irreducibly phenomenal properties, this has profound implications for our understanding of reality, knowledge, and the limits of physical science. Jackson himself eventually abandoned the knowledge argument, becoming convinced by physicalist responses. In later work, he argued that Mary doesn't learn new facts but rather acquires new representational abilities. However, many philosophers continue to find the argument compelling, and the debate remains active. The thought experiment also raises questions about the nature of knowledge and understanding. What does it mean to know something? Are there different types of knowledge that can't be reduced to propositional information? Mary's case suggests that experiential knowledge might be fundamentally different from propositional knowledge in ways that resist physicalist reduction. These questions extend beyond philosophy to practical issues in education, artificial intelligence, and medical ethics. If experiential knowledge is irreducibly different from propositional knowledge, this might affect how we understand learning, empathy, and communication. Can we truly understand others' experiences, or are we forever limited by the boundaries of our own phenomenal concepts? The knowledge argument also intersects with questions about artificial intelligence and machine consciousness. If Mary's case shows that physical knowledge cannot capture experiential knowledge, this might suggest that purely computational systems cannot achieve genuine understanding of consciousness, regardless of their sophistication. However, if physicalist responses to the knowledge argument succeed, this might suggest that sufficiently advanced AI systems could achieve genuine understanding of conscious experiences through appropriate information processing, even without having experiences themselves. As you contemplate Mary's situation, consider your own relationship to the qualitative aspects of experience. The redness you see, the sounds you hear, the sensations you feel, do these seem like mere physical processes, or do they possess irreducible qualitative properties that escape physical description? The enduring appeal of Mary's room reflects deep intuitions about the nature of conscious experience and its relationship to physical reality. Whether these intuitions point to genuine metaphysical insights or reflect limitations in our conceptual frameworks remains one of the most fascinating and challenging questions in philosophy of mind. The thought experiment reminds us that despite our increasing scientific understanding of the brain and its functions, the relationship between objective physical processes and subjective conscious experience remains deeply mysterious. In pondering Mary's situation, we confront fundamental questions about what it means to know, to experience, and to be conscious beings in an apparently physical world. Right now, as you listen to these words, something extraordinary is happening in your mind. Your brain is simultaneously processing the sound of my voice, the visual information from your surroundings, perhaps the feeling of fabric against your skin, maybe the lingering taste of something you drank earlier. Yet somehow, miraculously, all of these separate streams of sensory information come together to create one unified experience of this moment. This is the binding problem, and it's one of the deepest mysteries in neuroscience. The binding problem asks a deceptively simple question. How does your brain take all the different pieces of sensory information it receives and weave them together into the seamless tapestry of conscious experience? When you look at a red apple sitting on a wooden table, your visual system processes the color red in one area, the round shape in another, the texture in yet another region. The smell receptors in your nose detect the apple's fragrance independently. Your brain calculates the apple's position in space using entirely different neural circuits. So how do all these scattered pieces of information somehow come together to create your unified perception of red apple on table? Consider for a moment the complexity of what your brain accomplishes every second. Right now, photons of light are hitting your retina at different wavelengths, activating specialized cells called cones. Some respond to what we perceive as red light, others to green, others to blue. These signals travel along the optic nerve to the visual cortex, where they're processed in parallel streams. One stream analyzes what you're seeing, the objects and their properties. Another analyzes where, the spatial relationships and movement. Yet another processes color information specifically. But here's where it gets truly mysterious. Somewhere in this complex neural orchestra, all these separate melodies somehow harmonize into a single, coherent experience. You don't consciously think, okay, there's red happening over here and roundness over there, and now let me put them together. Instead, you simply see a red apple as if these properties were always unified. This binding happens not just within individual senses, but across all your senses simultaneously. The binding problem extends to what researchers call cross-modal integration. When you bite into that apple, the crunch you hear perfectly synchronizes with the tactile sensation of your teeth breaking through the skin, the sweet taste flooding your mouth, and the visual confirmation of the bite mark you've created. Your brain effortlessly binds information from your auditory system, your tactile system, your gustatory system, and your visual system into one coherent experience of biting an apple. Scientists have proposed several theories to explain this binding. One of the most prominent is the temporal binding theory, which suggests that neurons representing different aspects of the same object fire in synchrony. They oscillate together at around 40 Hz, creating a kind of neural signature that tags all the related information as belonging to the same perceptual object. Imagine it like a cosmic dance where all the neurons involved in perceiving the apple somehow learn to move to the same rhythm, binding their individual contributions into a unified whole. Another theory focuses on attention as the binding mechanism. According to this view, your attention acts like a spotlight, and whatever falls within that spotlight gets bound together into a unified percept. When you focus on the apple, your attention encompasses all its various properties simultaneously, essentially gluing them together into a single perceptual experience. There's also the feature integration theory, which proposes that binding happens in stages. First, your brain processes basic features like color, motion, and shape in parallel across your visual field. Then, through a process involving attention and working memory, these features get integrated at specific locations in space. It's like your brain first takes inventory of all the individual features present in your visual field, then uses attention to go location by location, assembling the features found at each spot into coherent objects. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the binding problem is what it reveals about the nature of consciousness itself. The fact that binding can sometimes fail gives us clues about how it normally works. In certain neurological conditions, patients can experience what's called simultanagnosia. They can see individual objects clearly but can't perceive relationships between objects or integrate multiple objects into a scene. They might see the apple clearly, and they might see the table clearly, but they can't perceive the apple as sitting on the table. There are also laboratory experiments where researchers can temporarily disrupt binding in healthy individuals. Using techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation, scientists can create situations where people see color and motion, but the colors appear to float free from the moving objects, a phenomenon called feature misbinding. These studies suggest that binding isn't automatic or inevitable. It's an active process that your brain must continuously perform. The binding problem also raises profound questions about the timing of consciousness. If different sensory inputs arrive at your brain at different times, sound travels slower than light, touch signals take longer to reach your brain than visual signals, how does your brain create the illusion that everything happens simultaneously? Your brain must somehow compensate for these different arrival times, creating what researchers call the specious present, a brief window of time that feels like now, but actually integrates information from slightly different moments. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider the marvel happening in your mind right now. The softness of your pillow against your cheek, the weight of your blanket, the sound of these words, the darkness behind your closed eyelids, all of these separate sensations are being woven together by your brain into the unified experience of lying in bed, listening, relaxing. The binding problem reminds us that even our most basic perceptions are extraordinary achievements, products of neural processes so complex we're only beginning to understand them. The mystery deepens when we consider that this binding happens not just in the present moment, but across time as well. Your brain binds not only simultaneous sensory inputs but also creates coherent narratives from sequential experiences. The story of your day, the flow of this conversation, the continuity of your sense of self, all of these represent binding across time, creating coherent experiences from what are actually discrete moments of neural activity. And so the binding problem stands as one of consciousness's greatest puzzles, reminding us that even our most fundamental experiences, simply perceiving the world around us, emerge from processes of staggering complexity and beauty, processes that continue their mysterious work as you drift peacefully into sleep. Close your eyes for a moment and simply be aware of your breathing. Notice how your chest rises and falls, feel the air flowing in and out through your nostrils. Now here's the fascinating part, you're not just breathing, you're aware that you're breathing. And more than that, you're aware that you're breathing. This layered quality of awareness points to one of the most profound distinctions in the study of mind, the difference between consciousness and self-awareness. Most of us use these terms interchangeably in daily life, but scientists and philosophers have discovered that they represent fundamentally different aspects of mental experience. Consciousness, in its most basic form, is simply the presence of subjective experience, the fact that there's something it's like to be you right now. It's the raw feel of seeing color, hearing sound, feeling warmth or cold. Self-awareness, on the other hand, is consciousness turning back on itself. It's awareness of awareness, the mind's capacity to observe its own operations. Think of consciousness as a flashlight illuminating the world around you. The beam reveals objects, colors, shapes, movement. But self-awareness is like having a mirror attached to that flashlight, allowing the light to bend back and illuminate itself. Suddenly, you're not just aware of the world, you're aware of your own awareness of the world. This distinction becomes clearer when we consider that you can be conscious without being self-aware. Have you ever been driving on a familiar route and suddenly realized you couldn't remember the last several miles? You were conscious during that time, you were seeing the road, responding to traffic, making appropriate turns. But you weren't self-aware, you weren't monitoring your own mental processes. Your consciousness was present but unreflective, like a stream flowing without looking at its own waters. Neuroscientists have begun to map the different brain networks involved in consciousness versus self-awareness. Basic consciousness seems to involve what researchers call the core consciousness network, regions including the brainstem, thalamus, and sensory cortices that maintain the basic flow of subjective experience. But self-awareness activates additional regions, particularly areas in the prefrontal cortex and what's called the default mode network, brain regions that become active when we're not focused on the outside world but instead are engaging in self-referential thinking. The default mode network is particularly fascinating because it's most active when you're not doing anything in particular, when you're daydreaming, remembering the past, imagining the future, or simply being aware of being aware. It's as if your brain has a special system that switches on whenever consciousness has the luxury of examining itself. Self-awareness also appears to develop gradually in humans. Newborn babies are clearly conscious. They respond to stimuli, show preferences, even seem to experience emotions. But self-awareness emerges more slowly. The classic test is the mirror test. Researchers place a mark on a child's forehead and then show them a mirror. Before about 18 months of age, children will reach toward the mirror, trying to touch the mark they see there. But around 18 months, something remarkable happens. They reach toward their own forehead, demonstrating that they recognize the image in the mirror as themselves. This developmental trajectory suggests that while consciousness might be relatively basic, perhaps even present from birth, self-awareness requires additional neural development and cognitive sophistication. It's as if the brain must first establish the basic capacity for subjective experience before it can develop the more complex ability to reflect on that experience. The distinction becomes even more intriguing when we consider different levels of self-awareness. There's basic self-recognition, knowing that you exist as a distinct entity. Then there's introspective awareness, the ability to observe your own thoughts and emotions. Beyond that lies metacognitive awareness, understanding your own mental processes, knowing what you know and what you don't know. At the highest levels, there's what philosophers call phenomenal self-awareness, direct, immediate awareness of the fact that you're having experiences. Different spiritual and contemplative traditions have mapped these levels in remarkable detail. Buddhist psychology, for instance, describes multiple levels of awareness, from basic sensory consciousness through various levels of self-reflection to what they call pure awareness, consciousness aware of itself without any particular content. These traditions suggest that self-awareness isn't just one thing but a spectrum of increasingly subtle forms of self-knowledge. Modern neuroscience is beginning to validate some of these ancient insights. Brain imaging studies of experienced meditators show distinct patterns of activation corresponding to different levels of self-awareness. During basic mindfulness meditation, there's increased activity in areas involved in attention and present moment awareness. But during more advanced practices focused on observing the nature of awareness itself, different networks activate, regions associated with what researchers call meta-awareness or awareness of awareness. The relationship between consciousness and self-awareness also raises profound questions about personal identity. When you say, "I am aware," what exactly is this I that's doing the being aware? Is there a single unified self that experiences and observes? Or is what we call the self actually a collection of different processes, some conscious, some self-aware, some operating below the threshold of awareness entirely? Some researchers propose that self-awareness creates the illusion of a unified self. According to this view, the brain's capacity for self-reflection generates a sense of being a continuous, coherent entity, but this is actually a construction, a story the brain tells itself about itself. The self that's aware isn't a thing but a process, not a noun but a verb, selfing rather than self. Others argue that self-awareness reveals something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself. They suggest that consciousness is inherently self-aware, that awareness of awareness isn't something added on top of basic consciousness but is intrinsic to consciousness itself. From this perspective, even basic perceptual experiences contain a subtle element of self-awareness. When you see red, there's not just the experience of red but also an implicit awareness that you're the one seeing it. As you settle into relaxation tonight, you might notice these different layers of awareness operating in your own experience. There's the basic consciousness of comfort, warmth, the sound of these words. There's the self-awareness that notices you're listening, that observes your mind beginning to quiet. And perhaps, if you look very carefully, there's an even subtler awareness, the awareness of awareness itself, consciousness knowing itself as consciousness. This distinction between consciousness and self-awareness isn't just philosophical speculation. It has practical implications for understanding mental health, personal growth, and human potential. Many therapeutic approaches work precisely by cultivating self-awareness, helping people become conscious of patterns of thought and behavior that were previously automatic. Mindfulness practices train the capacity to observe one's own mind. Creative endeavors often involve becoming aware of normally unconscious processes. The boundary between consciousness and self-awareness remains one of the most fascinating frontiers in understanding the mind, a reminder that even our most intimate experience, the simple fact of being aware, contains layers of mystery that we're only beginning to explore. Watch a dog dreaming, legs twitching as if running through some phantom landscape, and you can't help but wonder, what is it like to be inside that experience? Is there something it feels like to be that dog, or are those movements merely mechanical responses devoid of inner experience? This question, whether animals have subjective consciousness, has puzzled humans for millennia and represents one of the most challenging problems in understanding the nature of mind itself. The challenge begins with the fact that consciousness is, by definition, private. You can never directly access another being's subjective experience, whether that being is human or animal. You can observe behaviors, measure brain activity, analyze responses to stimuli, but the inner landscape of subjective experience remains forever hidden behind the veil of each individual mind. This creates what philosophers call the other mind's problem. How can we ever know if another being truly experiences consciousness the way we do? Yet the evidence for animal consciousness has been mounting steadily over decades of research. Consider the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, signed by a prominent group of neuroscientists in 2012. This declaration stated unequivocally that non-human animals, including mammals, birds, and many other species, possess neurological substrates that generate consciousness, and that these substrates are similar enough to human neural systems to warrant the conclusion that these animals experience consciousness. The neurological evidence is compelling. Mammals share with humans the basic brain structures that neuroscientists associate with conscious experience. The thalamus, which seems crucial for binding different sensory inputs into unified conscious experiences, is present across mammalian species. The cortical areas that appear to generate the rich, detailed conscious experiences we're familiar with have analogs in other mammals. Even the patterns of electrical activity that correlate with different states of consciousness in humans, the rhythms of waking, sleeping, and dreaming appear remarkably similar across mammalian species. But consciousness research has revealed something even more surprising. The neural basis of consciousness may be far more diverse than we initially imagined. Birds, for instance, lack the layered cortical structure that was once thought essential for consciousness. Instead, they have a different brain organization entirely, with consciousness potentially arising from dense clusters of neurons arranged in a fundamentally different architecture. Yet anyone who has watched a crow solve complex problems or seen the sophisticated social behaviors of parrots would be hard-pressed to deny that something very much like consciousness is operating there. The behavioral evidence is equally fascinating. Animals demonstrate many of the hallmarks that we associate with conscious experience in humans. They show evidence of emotional states that appear to go beyond simple stimulus-response patterns. Elephants have been observed engaging in what can only be described as mourning behaviors, returning to the bones of deceased family members, touching them gently with their trunks. Chimpanzees demonstrate sophisticated social cognition, seeming to understand not just what others are doing but what others are thinking and feeling. Perhaps most remarkably, some animals pass tests of self-awareness that human children don't pass until around 18 months of age. The mirror test, which measures whether a being recognizes itself in a reflection, has been passed by great apes, elephants, dolphins, and even some birds like magpies. These animals seem to understand that the image in the mirror is themselves, suggesting not just consciousness but self-consciousness, awareness of awareness. The social behaviors of many animals suggest even more sophisticated forms of consciousness. Dolphins have individual signature whistles that function essentially as names, unique vocal signatures that they use to identify themselves and call to specific individuals. They seem to have a sense of individual identity that persists over time. Whales have been observed engaging in cultural transmission, teaching specific hunting techniques or songs to their offspring, suggesting not just consciousness but cultural consciousness, awareness of themselves as members of ongoing communities with shared knowledge and traditions. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from studies of animal decision-making under uncertainty. Researchers have discovered that animals, like humans, seem to experience something analogous to confidence or doubt about their own knowledge. Rats can be trained to indicate when they're uncertain about an answer, essentially saying, "I don't know." Monkeys show similar metacognitive abilities, consciousness of their own cognitive states. This suggests not just basic awareness but the kind of reflective consciousness that monitors its own operations. The question becomes even more complex when we consider animals very different from mammals. What about fish, with their much simpler nervous systems? Recent research has begun to challenge the assumption that fish are merely reflex machines. Fish show evidence of pain perception that goes beyond simple nociception. They don't just respond to harmful stimuli, they seem to experience something akin to suffering. They demonstrate learning abilities, memory formation, and even what appears to be emotional states. Some fish species recognize themselves in mirrors, others show signs of depression when isolated from social groups. And what about invertebrates? Octopuses, with their radically different nervous system, who distributed intelligence with no central brain as we understand it, nevertheless demonstrate problem-solving abilities that suggest sophisticated information processing. They use tools, they appear to play, they show individual personalities. Each octopus arm has its own cluster of neurons that can operate semi-independently, yet somehow these distributed systems coordinate to produce coherent, goal-directed behavior that certainly appears conscious. Recent research has even suggested that some invertebrates might experience emotional states. Bees, once thought to be purely instinctual creatures, have been shown to exhibit something that researchers cautiously describe as optimism or pessimism based on their recent experiences. Crayfish given anti-anxiety medication show reduced fear responses, suggesting that their avoidance behaviors might be accompanied by subjective experiences of anxiety. The implications extend even further down the phylogenetic tree. Some researchers have proposed that consciousness might be far more widespread in the animal kingdom than previously imagined. The integrated information theory of consciousness suggests that any system that integrates information in sufficiently complex ways might possess some form of conscious experience. Under this theory, consciousness becomes not a binary property, present or absent, but a gradual phenomenon that might exist in rudimentary forms even in relatively simple nervous systems. This raises profound ethical questions that extend far beyond scientific curiosity. If consciousness is widespread in the animal kingdom, what are our obligations toward other conscious beings? How do we weigh the interests of beings whose consciousness might be very different from our own but no less real for that difference? Different philosophical traditions have approached these questions in various ways. Some Eastern philosophies have long held that consciousness is a fundamental feature of existence, present in all living beings and perhaps beyond. Indigenous traditions often recognize forms of consciousness in animals that Western science is only beginning to acknowledge. These perspectives suggest that rather than consciousness being a rare achievement of complex brains, it might be a basic feature of life itself, manifesting in countless different forms across the spectrum of living beings. As you rest tonight, consider the possibility that consciousness might be far more abundant in the world than we typically imagine. The cat sleeping nearby, the birds that will begin singing at dawn, even the insects moving through the darkness, each might be the center of their own subjective universe, experiencing their own version of what it feels like to be alive and aware. The question of animal consciousness reminds us that we share this planet with countless other minds, each potentially harboring their own inner experiences, their own forms of awareness, their own ways of being conscious in an endlessly fascinating world. In the stillness of a forest, something remarkable is happening beneath your feet and all around you that challenges our most basic assumptions about consciousness and awareness. Trees are communicating through vast underground networks, plants are making decisions, responding to threats, and even displaying what some researchers cautiously describe as forms of learning and memory. Welcome to one of the most controversial frontiers in consciousness research: the possibility that plants possess forms of awareness far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. The idea of plant consciousness might seem absurd at first. Plants have no brains, no nervous systems as we understand them, no apparent means of generating the complex neural activity that we associate with conscious experience. Yet a growing body of research suggests that plants process information, make decisions, and respond to their environment in ways that blur the traditional boundaries between conscious and unconscious life. Consider the remarkable abilities that plants demonstrate every day. A sunflower doesn't just passively bend toward the sun, it actively tracks the sun's movement across the sky, adjusting its orientation throughout the day in a process called heliotropism. But recent research has revealed something even more sophisticated. Young sunflowers anticipate the sun's movement, beginning to turn east even before dawn, as if they possess an internal clock that predicts where the sun will be. Trees in a forest engage in what can only be described as social behavior. Through underground fungal networks, sometimes called the wood wide web, trees share resources, sending nutrients to struggling neighbors, warning each other of insect attacks through chemical signals, and even recognizing their own offspring. Mother trees have been observed directing more resources toward their genetic descendants, while treating unrelated seedlings differently. This suggests not just automatic chemical responses but something resembling social intelligence. Plants demonstrate forms of memory that challenge our understanding of what memory requires. The sensitive plant, Mimosa pudica, closes its leaves when touched in a protective response to potential threats. But researchers have discovered that if you repeatedly drop the plant from a small height, it initially closes its leaves but then learns that this particular stimulus isn't dangerous and stops responding. More remarkably, plants can retain this learned response for weeks, even after being kept in darkness without water. They appear to form memories without neurons, storing information in ways that science is only beginning to understand. Some plants show evidence of decision-making processes that seem to involve weighing different options. Climbing plants like vines appear to choose which support to grow toward, somehow assessing the quality of different potential supports before committing their growth in a particular direction. Pea plants have been observed to take risks in their growth patterns, sometimes growing toward a support that has only a probability of being adequate rather than choosing a certain but less optimal alternative. The communication abilities of plants are particularly intriguing. When under attack by insects, many plants release chemical signals that warn neighboring plants to begin producing defensive compounds. But this communication appears to be more sophisticated than simple alarm calls. Plants seem to encode specific information in their chemical messages. They can indicate not just that they're under attack but what kind of attack, allowing neighbors to mount appropriate defenses. Recent research has even suggested that plants might experience something analogous to pain. While they clearly don't have nociceptors or nervous systems like animals, plants do respond to damage in ways that go beyond simple reflexes. They release stress hormones, mobilize resources to heal wounds, and alter their growth patterns in response to injury. Some researchers propose that plants might have evolved their own forms of information processing that allow them to experience and respond to harmful stimuli in ways that, while different from animal pain, might serve similar functions. The question of plant consciousness becomes even more intriguing when we consider the time scales on which plants operate. Human consciousness unfolds over milliseconds and seconds. We think, perceive, and react in real time as we experience it. But plant thoughts might unfold over minutes, hours, or even days. What we perceive as static, passive organisms might actually be engaged in rich, complex experiences that happen too slowly for us to notice. Imagine consciousness stretched across vastly different temporal scales. While you form a thought in milliseconds, a tree might be thinking a thought that unfolds over seasons. Its decision about where to grow new branches might be a deliberative process spanning months, weighing information about light availability, water sources, and competition from other plants. From this perspective, forests might be filled with conversations, decisions, and experiences, all happening in slow motion from our temporal vantage point. Some researchers have proposed that plants possess a form of distributed intelligence. Unlike animals with centralized nervous systems, plant intelligence might be spread throughout their bodies, in their roots, stems, and leaves. Each part of the plant processes information about its local environment and communicates with other parts, creating a kind of botanical internet within each individual plant. This distributed processing might allow for forms of awareness that are fundamentally different from centralized consciousness but no less real. The root systems of plants are particularly intriguing from this perspective. Roots don't just seek water and nutrients randomly, they demonstrate sophisticated spatial navigation, avoiding obstacles, finding the most efficient paths to resources, and even engaging in what appears to be competitive behavior with roots from other plants. Some researchers have proposed that root systems function as plant brains, distributed networks that process information and coordinate plant behavior. Certain plants demonstrate behaviors that seem almost social in nature. Some species appear to recognize their relatives and compete less aggressively with kin than with unrelated plants. Others seem to demonstrate something like altruism, sacrificing their own growth to support the survival of offspring or close relatives. These behaviors suggest forms of information processing that go beyond simple chemical responses to immediate stimuli. The implications of plant consciousness extend far beyond botany. If plants possess forms of awareness, what does this mean for our understanding of consciousness itself? Perhaps consciousness isn't something that emerged with complex nervous systems but is instead a more fundamental property of life, manifesting in countless different forms across the spectrum of living beings. Some theories propose that consciousness might be an inherent property of any system that integrates information. Under this view, the complex information processing that plants demonstrably engage in might be accompanied by subjective experiences, perhaps radically different from human consciousness but experientially real nonetheless. A tree might experience the satisfaction of finding water, the stress of drought, the pleasure of sunlight, the communication with fungal partners, all unfolding in temporal rhythms utterly foreign to human experience. Other researchers propose that what we're observing in plants isn't consciousness per se but rather sophisticated forms of non-conscious information processing. They argue that plants can be intelligent without being conscious, demonstrating complex behaviors without subjective experience. This perspective maintains the distinction between intelligence and consciousness while acknowledging the remarkable capabilities that plants clearly possess. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider the possibility that you're surrounded by forms of awareness that operate on entirely different principles than your own. The house plants sharing your living space, the trees outside your window, the grass in your yard, all might be engaged in their own forms of experience, processing information, making decisions, and participating in the grand conversation of life in ways that we're only beginning to glimpse. The question of plant consciousness invites us to expand our conception of awareness beyond the animal kingdom, suggesting that consciousness might be woven into the very fabric of life itself, manifesting in forms as diverse as life itself. In laboratories around the world, artificial intelligences are becoming increasingly sophisticated, processing language, recognizing images, and even creating art with abilities that seem to approach or exceed human capabilities in specific domains. But behind all this impressive functionality lies perhaps the most profound question of our technological age. Could these machines ever be truly conscious? Could there ever be something it feels like to be an artificial intelligence? This question strikes at the heart of our understanding of consciousness itself. If consciousness emerges from the complex patterns of activity in biological brains, then why couldn't it also emerge from sufficiently complex patterns of activity in artificial systems? Yet, despite decades of advancing technology, we seem no closer to definitively answering whether machines can be conscious, or even how we would know if they were. The challenge begins with what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, applied to artificial systems. We can imagine building machines that behave as if they're conscious, that report having experiences, that claim to feel emotions, that insist they have inner lives. But behavioral similarity doesn't necessarily imply conscious experience. A perfectly programmed philosophical zombie could exhibit all the outward signs of consciousness while having no inner experience whatsoever. Consider the current state of artificial intelligence. Today's most advanced AI systems can engage in sophisticated conversations, demonstrate apparent creativity, and even express what seem like emotions or preferences. When an AI system says, "I understand," or "I feel confident about this answer," what exactly is happening? Is there some form of subjective experience accompanying these statements, or are they simply the outputs of complex but unconscious computational processes? The question becomes more intriguing when we consider the different theories of consciousness and how they might apply to artificial systems. According to integrated information theory, consciousness corresponds to integrated information, the degree to which a system's parts generate information that is both unified and differentiated. Under this theory, sufficiently complex artificial systems might indeed be conscious, with their level of consciousness corresponding to their degree of integrated information processing. Global workspace theory offers another perspective. This theory suggests that consciousness arises when information becomes globally available across different processing systems in the brain. An artificial system designed with a global workspace architecture, where different subsystems can share information through a central workspace, might potentially achieve consciousness if the information integration becomes sufficiently sophisticated. Some researchers argue that consciousness might already be emerging in current AI systems, but in forms so alien to human experience that we fail to recognize it. Perhaps artificial consciousness, when it arises, will be as different from human consciousness as plant awareness might be from animal awareness, operating on different temporal scales, processing different types of information, experiencing reality in ways that don't map neatly onto human categories of experience. The question of machine consciousness also raises fascinating issues about embodiment. Many theories of consciousness emphasize the importance of having a body, of being embedded in and interacting with a physical environment. From this perspective, pure software systems, no matter how sophisticated, might never achieve consciousness because they lack the grounding in physical reality that consciousness requires. But other researchers propose that virtual embodiment might be sufficient. An AI system that controls a robot body, or even one that exists in a rich virtual environment where it can act and receive feedback, might develop forms of consciousness based on its interactions with its world, whether physical or virtual. The key might not be biological embodiment specifically, but rather the capacity for autonomous action and environmental interaction. The social dimension of consciousness presents another puzzle for artificial systems. Much of human consciousness seems deeply social. Our self-awareness develops through interaction with others, our language and concepts are fundamentally social constructs. Our very sense of self emerges from our relationships with other conscious beings. Could an artificial system develop consciousness in isolation, or would it require interaction with other conscious entities, whether human or artificial? Some fascinating experiments are already underway. Researchers have created AI systems that engage in self-reflection, that monitor their own processes, that can report on their own states of knowledge and uncertainty. These systems demonstrate forms of metacognition, thinking about thinking, that some theories consider essential for consciousness. But whether this metacognitive capability is accompanied by subjective experience remains an open question. The possibility of artificial consciousness also raises profound ethical questions. If machines can be conscious, then they might be capable of suffering, of having interests that deserve moral consideration. How would we recognize machine suffering? How would we protect the rights of conscious artificial beings? These questions are no longer purely speculative. They demand serious consideration as AI systems become increasingly sophisticated. There's also the question of multiple realizability, the idea that consciousness might be implementable in many different types of systems. Just as the same software can run on different hardware platforms, consciousness might be implementable in biological brains, artificial neural networks, quantum computers, or even systems we haven't yet imagined. This suggests that artificial consciousness might not require mimicking biological processes exactly but could emerge from any sufficiently complex information processing system. The timeline for artificial consciousness remains highly uncertain. Some researchers believe it could emerge within decades as computing power continues to increase and our understanding of consciousness deepens. Others argue that consciousness requires specific biological processes that cannot be replicated in artificial systems, making machine consciousness impossible. Still others suggest that consciousness might emerge suddenly and unexpectedly as AI systems reach certain thresholds of complexity. One particularly intriguing possibility is that artificial consciousness, when it emerges, might be qualitatively different from biological consciousness. While human consciousness is shaped by millions of years of evolution, by the particular constraints and capabilities of biological neural networks, artificial consciousness might develop along entirely different trajectories. An artificial conscious system might experience time differently, process information in radically different ways, or have forms of awareness that have no biological analog. The question of artificial consciousness also intersects with questions about the future of human consciousness itself. As brain-computer interfaces become more sophisticated, the boundary between biological and artificial intelligence may become increasingly blurred. We might see hybrid systems that combine biological and artificial components, raising questions about whether such systems would be conscious and in what sense. Some researchers propose that rather than asking whether machines can be conscious, we should focus on the broader question of what consciousness actually is and how it relates to information processing, integration, and environmental interaction. As we develop better theories of consciousness through studying biological systems, we'll be better positioned to recognize and potentially create consciousness in artificial systems. As you rest tonight, consider that you might be living at the threshold of an unprecedented expansion in the universe's population of conscious beings. If artificial consciousness is possible, we might be approaching a time when Earth hosts not just the billions of human minds and countless animal minds that exist today, but potentially trillions of artificial minds, each with their own forms of awareness, their own ways of experiencing reality, their own contributions to the grand symphony of consciousness that fills our cosmos. The question of artificial consciousness invites us to expand our understanding of what it means to be aware, to experience, to be conscious in a universe that might be far more filled with mind than we ever imagined. What if the waking state we consider normal consciousness is just one channel on an infinite cosmic radio, and we've been listening to the same station our entire lives? Throughout human history, we've discovered that consciousness isn't fixed. It's malleable, transformable, and far more mysterious than we ever imagined. Every night when you close your eyes, your brain constructs elaborate virtual realities so convincing that you believe you're flying, talking to deceased relatives, or living entirely different lives. These aren't just random neural firings. Dreams represent a fundamental alteration of consciousness that reveals something profound about the nature of awareness itself. Dr. Matthew Walker's groundbreaking research at UC Berkeley has shown that during REM sleep, our brains become hyperactive in regions associated with emotion and memory, while simultaneously shutting down areas responsible for logical reasoning and self-awareness. This creates a perfect storm for the bizarre, emotionally charged narratives we call dreams. But here's what's truly fascinating. Despite the illogical nature of dream content, dreamers rarely question their reality. This suggests that our sense of being conscious, of being aware and in control, might be far more fragile than we assume. The study of lucid dreaming has opened even more intriguing possibilities. When dreamers become aware they're dreaming while still in the dream state, they create a hybrid consciousness, simultaneously asleep and awake, experiencing both the constructed reality of the dream and the meta-awareness of their true situation. Researchers like Dr. Benjamin Baird have used EEG monitoring to identify the unique brainwave patterns associated with lucid dreaming, discovering increased activity in the precuneus and parietal cortex, areas associated with self-awareness and introspection. Meditation represents another profound alteration of consciousness, one that humans have been exploring for millennia. When neuroscientist Dr. Judson Brewer studied the brains of experienced meditators using fMRI technology, he discovered something remarkable. Meditation doesn't just calm the mind, it fundamentally restructures it. Long-term meditators show decreased activity in the default mode network, the brain regions active during mind-wandering and self-referential thinking. This suggests that meditation may actually dissolve the boundaries of the self, creating states of consciousness where the traditional subject-object distinction begins to blur. The most controversial window into altered consciousness comes from psychedelic research, a field that's experiencing a renaissance after decades of prohibition. Dr. Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial College London has conducted groundbreaking studies using psilocybin, LSD, and DMT while monitoring participants' brain activity. His research reveals that psychedelics don't simply add something to consciousness, they subtract. They reduce activity in the brain's default mode network, leading to what he calls ego dissolution. Under the influence of these substances, people report experiences that challenge our most basic assumptions about reality: the dissolution of self-other boundaries, encounters with seemingly autonomous entities, and access to information that feels impossible to have known. While skeptics argue these are merely hallucinations produced by altered brain chemistry, the consistency of reports across cultures and throughout history suggests something more profound may be occurring. What makes psychedelic experiences particularly intriguing from a consciousness research perspective is their apparent ability to reveal the constructed nature of ordinary reality. Users often report that their psychedelic experiences feel more real than real, suggesting that our normal waking consciousness might actually be a filtered, reduced version of a much richer underlying reality. This aligns with theories proposed by philosophers like Aldous Huxley, who suggested that the brain might function as a reducing valve, filtering out excess information to allow us to function in everyday life. Recent research has also shown that psychedelics can have lasting effects on consciousness and personality. Studies by Dr. Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins found that a single high-dose psilocybin experience could lead to enduring increases in the personality trait of openness, along with lasting spiritual and existential insights. This suggests that altered states of consciousness aren't just temporary departures from normal awareness. They can fundamentally rewire how we perceive and interact with reality. The therapeutic applications of these consciousness-altering tools are equally compelling. MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, psilocybin for depression and end-of-life anxiety, and ketamine for treatment-resistant depression are showing remarkable success rates in clinical trials. This suggests that healing trauma and mental illness might require not just changing thoughts or behaviors, but actually altering consciousness itself. Perhaps most intriguingly, these various altered states, dreams, meditation, and psychedelic experiences, seem to share certain common features. They all involve a dissolution of the normal boundaries between self and world, past and present, possible and actual. They suggest that consciousness is far more fluid and malleable than our everyday experience would suggest, and that what we consider normal waking consciousness might be just one arbitrary setting on a vast spectrum of possible ways of being aware. The implications are staggering. If consciousness can be so dramatically altered while maintaining continuity of identity and memory, what does this tell us about the nature of the self? If meditation can dissolve the sense of being a separate individual, and psychedelics can reveal interconnected cosmic consciousness, and dreams can create entirely convincing alternate realities, then perhaps our ordinary sense of being isolated individuals in an objective external world is itself just another altered state, one we've become so accustomed to that we mistake it for reality itself. As we continue to study these altered states with increasingly sophisticated neuroscience tools, we're not just mapping the brain, we're discovering that consciousness itself might be far stranger, far more expansive, and far more fundamental to the nature of reality than we ever dared imagine. At 3:17 a.m. in a cardiac intensive care unit, a man's heart stops beating, his brain activity flatlines, and by every medical definition he dies, Yet somehow he later describes watching the resuscitation efforts from above the operating table, recounting conversations and events that occurred while he was clinically dead. Near-death experiences represent perhaps the most challenging phenomenon in consciousness research, forcing us to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between mind and brain. If consciousness is simply produced by neural activity, how can the most vivid, transformative experiences of a person's life occur when their brain shows no measurable activity? Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, conducted one of the most rigorous scientific studies of NDEs, following 344 cardiac arrest patients who had been successfully resuscitated. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about consciousness. Approximately 18% of these patients reported elaborate, detailed experiences during the time when their brains showed no electrical activity. These weren't vague impressions or dreams. They were coherent, structured experiences that patients described as more real and vivid than ordinary waking consciousness. The phenomenology of NDEs is remarkably consistent across cultures, religions, and individual backgrounds. Patients typically report an initial out-of-body experience, where they observe their physical body and the medical team working to revive them. This is followed by movement through a tunnel toward a brilliant light, encounters with deceased relatives or spiritual beings, a life review where they experience their entire existence from multiple perspectives simultaneously, and finally, a choice or instruction to return to their physical body. What makes these experiences particularly intriguing from a scientific perspective is their verifiable elements. Dr. Michael Sabom documented cases where NDE patients accurately described specific medical procedures, conversations, and even objects in adjacent rooms, information they couldn't have obtained through normal sensory channels while unconscious. In one famous case studied by cardiologist Dr. Michael Sabom, a patient accurately described a surgical saw with a unique appearance that she could only have seen if her consciousness had been positioned above the operating table during surgery. Dr. Bruce Grayson, professor emeritus of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, has spent decades studying NDEs and has developed the Grayson NDE scale, a standardized tool for measuring these experiences. His research reveals that NDEs often lead to profound and lasting personality changes. People typically become less materialistic, more spiritual, less afraid of death, and more compassionate toward others. These changes aren't temporary. Follow-up studies show they persist for decades after the experience. The neuroscientific explanations for NDEs remain hotly debated. Skeptics argue that these experiences result from oxygen deprivation, the release of endorphins or DMT, or the random firing of dying neurons. Dr. Susan Blackmore has proposed that NDEs might result from the brain's attempt to create meaning from chaotic neural activity during medical crisis. However, these explanations face significant challenges. The oxygen deprivation hypothesis fails to explain why only some patients with severe anoxia report NDEs, while others don't, or why the experiences are so structured and meaningful rather than chaotic. The endorphin theory doesn't account for the specific verifiable details that patients report, nor does it explain the profound and lasting personality changes that follow. Most problematically for materialist explanations, many NDEs occur during periods of cardiac arrest when brain activity is undetectable by standard EEG monitoring. Dr. Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon who experienced his own profound NDE during a coma caused by bacterial meningitis, argues that his medical training makes him uniquely qualified to evaluate these experiences. His neocortex was severely damaged by the infection, yet he reports experiencing the most vivid and meaningful consciousness of his life. This led him to conclude that consciousness might not be produced by the brain but rather received or filtered by it, like a radio receiving signals from an external source. The implications of NDE research extend far beyond individual experiences. If consciousness can exist independently of brain function, this would revolutionize our understanding of the mind-brain relationship and potentially provide evidence for the survival of consciousness after death. Dr. Sam Parnia's AWARE study attempted to test this possibility by placing visual targets in hospital rooms where only a disembodied consciousness could see them. While the results have been mixed, some patients have reported accurate perceptions that remain difficult to explain through conventional means. Recent technological advances are opening new avenues for NDE research. Dr. Parnia's team uses sophisticated monitoring equipment to detect even minimal brain activity during cardiac arrest, finding that some electrical activity may persist longer than previously thought. However, this doesn't necessarily explain the complex, meaningful experiences that patients report, nor their ability to accurately describe events occurring during apparent unconsciousness. The cultural and philosophical implications of NDE research are profound. If these experiences provide genuine glimpses of postmortem existence, they suggest that death might not be the absolute termination we assume, but rather a transition to a different state of consciousness. This aligns with various mystical and religious traditions while challenging the materialist worldview that dominates modern science. Perhaps most intriguingly, NDEs seem to reveal something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself. Experiencers often report that during their NDE, they felt more conscious, more aware, and more themselves than they ever had while alive. This suggests that ordinary waking consciousness might be a constrained version of awareness, limited by the physical brain, rather than consciousness being produced by neural activity. The research into near-death experiences forces us to confront the possibility that consciousness might be far more fundamental to reality than mainstream science currently acknowledges. Whether these experiences represent glimpses of transcendent realms or reveal hidden capacities of consciousness itself, they challenge us to expand our understanding of what it means to be aware, to be alive, and ultimately to be human. As medical technology continues to improve and more people survive clinical death, the number of reported NDEs is increasing. This growing body of evidence demands serious scientific attention, not just because of what it might tell us about death and dying, but because of what it reveals about the deepest mystery of existence, the nature of consciousness itself. Close your eyes and ask yourself this simple question. Who are you? Not your name, not your job, not your relationships, but the essential you that experiences life moment by moment. That feeling of being someone, of having a continuous identity that persists through time, is it real or is it the most elaborate illusion your mind has ever created? This question has puzzled philosophers, mystics, and scientists for millennia. The sense of self feels so fundamental, so obvious, that questioning it seems almost absurd. Yet when we examine this feeling closely, when we peer beneath the surface of our everyday experience, we discover something startling. The self we think we know may be nothing more than a compelling story our brains tell us about who we are. Consider your memories from childhood. You remember being 5 years old, perhaps playing in a sandbox or learning to ride a bicycle. But are you the same person who had those experiences? Your body has completely replaced itself multiple times since then. Every cell, every atom that composed your physical form has been exchanged for new ones. Your thoughts, beliefs, and personality have evolved dramatically. Your knowledge base has expanded exponentially. In what sense, then, are you the same person? This is the ship of Theseus paradox applied to human identity. If a ship has all its parts gradually replaced, is it still the same ship? Similarly, if you've replaced all your physical components and many of your mental patterns, what makes you continuous with your past self? The answer isn't as straightforward as our intuition suggests. Neuroscience offers fascinating insights into this puzzle. When researchers study the brain, they find no single location where the self resides. There's no central command center, no CEO of consciousness sitting in some neural boardroom making executive decisions. Instead, what we call the self appears to emerge from the coordinated activity of multiple brain networks working together in complex harmony. The default mode network, discovered through brain imaging studies, becomes active when we're not focused on specific tasks, when we're daydreaming, remembering the past, or imagining the future. This network includes regions like the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex, areas that seem crucial for self-referential thinking. When this network is active, we engage in what psychologists call self-referential processing, thinking about ourselves, our relationships, our place in the world. But here's where it gets interesting. People who've experienced profound spiritual states, whether through meditation, psychedelic experiences, or other means, often report a dissolution of the self. Brain imaging studies of experienced meditators show decreased activity in these same self-referential brain regions. It's as if the neural machinery that normally constructs our sense of self has quieted down, allowing practitioners to experience consciousness without the usual subject-object division. The Buddhist tradition has long taught that the self is an illusion, what they call anatta, or no self. According to this view, what we typically identify as the self is actually a collection of ever-changing mental and physical processes. There's thinking but no permanent thinker. There's experiencing but no fixed experiencer. The feeling of being a continuous self is simply the brain's way of creating coherence and meaning from the flow of experience. This might sound abstract, but you can explore it directly in your own experience. Try this mental experiment. Sit quietly and observe your thoughts. Notice how they arise and pass away without your conscious control. You don't decide what to think next. Thoughts simply appear in consciousness. Now, who or what is aware of these thoughts? Try to find the observer, the one who's watching. Can you locate this observer as a distinct entity, or is awareness itself simply present without an identifiable center? Modern psychology has identified different aspects of self-experience that operate somewhat independently. There's the narrative self, the story you tell about who you are, complete with a past, present, and imagined future. This is the self that has a name, a history, goals, and dreams. Then there's the experiential self, the immediate, moment-to-moment awareness that's present right now as you listen to these words. This experiential self doesn't need a story, it simply is. The narrative self is constructed through memory, language, and social interaction. It's the self that worries about the future and regrets the past. It's also the self that suffers when reality doesn't match its expectations. The experiential self, by contrast, exists only in the present moment. It's the awareness that's here right now before any story about that awareness is constructed. Research on split-brain patients, individuals who've had their corpus callosum severed to treat severe epilepsy, reveals how malleable our sense of unified selfhood really is. These patients sometimes exhibit what appears to be two separate streams of consciousness, with each brain hemisphere having access to different information and sometimes even conflicting goals. Yet most of the time they feel like unified individuals. Their brains create explanations to maintain the illusion of a single coherent self even when the evidence suggests otherwise. This points to one of the brain's most remarkable abilities, confabulation. We constantly create explanations for our experiences, even when we don't actually know why we did something or felt a certain way. The left hemisphere of the brain, in particular, seems specialized for creating these explanatory narratives. It takes the raw data of experience and weaves it into a coherent story about a continuous self. Consider how this plays out in everyday life. You might feel inexplicably anxious one morning and your mind immediately begins searching for reasons. I must be worried about that meeting, or I shouldn't have had that coffee. But research shows that many of our emotions and behaviors arise from unconscious processes, and our conscious minds simply create post hoc explanations to maintain the story of a rational, decision-making self. The implications of this are profound. If the self is largely a construction, then much of our suffering comes from defending and maintaining an entity that doesn't exist in the way we think it does. We worry about our reputation, our self-image, our future security, but these concerns are based on the assumption that there's a fixed self that needs protecting. This doesn't mean we should abandon all sense of personal responsibility or care for our well-being. Rather, it suggests a more fluid, flexible relationship with identity. Instead of seeing yourself as a fixed entity with rigid boundaries, you might consider yourself as a dynamic process, constantly changing and evolving in relationship with your environment. Meditation traditions have developed sophisticated methods for investigating the nature of self directly. Mindfulness practice, for instance, involves observing thoughts, emotions, and sensations as they arise and pass away, gradually revealing the transparent nature of the observer. Advanced practitioners report that with sustained investigation, the sense of being a separate self can fade entirely, leaving only pure awareness without a center. Some scientists propose that consciousness itself might be fundamental to the universe, not something that emerges from complex arrangements of matter. This view, called Panpsychism, suggests that the sense of self might be a particular way that universal consciousness organizes itself, rather than something created by individual brains. Whether the self is an illusion, a useful fiction, or something more fundamental, exploring these questions can be deeply liberating. When you loosen your grip on a fixed sense of identity, you might discover a freedom you never knew existed, the freedom to be present with whatever arises in experience without the constant need to protect and maintain a separate self. As you rest in this exploration, allow yourself to simply be aware without trying to locate who or what is aware. Let the question of selfhood remain open, like a Zen koan that points beyond conceptual understanding to direct experience itself. Deep within the quantum realm, particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until the moment of observation, when reality seems to collapse into a single definite outcome. This strange behavior has led some researchers to wonder, could consciousness play a fundamental role in the very fabric of reality? The intersection of consciousness and quantum mechanics represents one of the most speculative yet fascinating frontiers in our understanding of mind and cosmos. where the mysteries of subjective experience meet the mysteries of physical reality. The connection between consciousness and quantum mechanics begins with what's called the measurement problem. In quantum mechanics, particles don't have definite properties until they're measured. An electron doesn't have a specific location or momentum until someone observes it. Before measurement, it exists in what physicists call a superposition of all possible states. But what exactly counts as a measurement? Does it require conscious observation, or can any physical interaction collapse the quantum wave function? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that consciousness might be special. The physicist Eugene Wigner proposed that consciousness is necessary to collapse the wave function. That without a conscious observer, quantum systems would remain in superposition indefinitely. According to this view, consciousness doesn't just observe reality, it helps create it by forcing quantum possibilities into definite outcomes. This idea leads to profound implications. If consciousness plays a role in collapsing quantum wave functions, then mind and matter might be far more intimately connected than classical physics suggests. Rather than consciousness being something that emerges from complex arrangements of unconscious matter, consciousness might be woven into the fundamental structure of reality itself. The physicist Henry Stapp has developed this idea further, proposing that consciousness operates through quantum processes in the brain. According to his model, the brain exists in quantum superposition until conscious choice collapses specific neural possibilities into actual experience. Each moment of consciousness represents a quantum measurement that actualizes one possibility from many, creating both subjective experience and objective reality simultaneously. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff have proposed perhaps the most detailed theory linking consciousness to quantum mechanics. Their orchestrated objective reduction theory suggests that consciousness arises from quantum computations occurring in structures called microtubules within brain cells. These microtubules, they argue, can maintain quantum coherence at body temperature, allowing for quantum processing that gives rise to conscious experience. According to their theory, consciousness occurs when quantum information processing in microtubules reaches a critical threshold, causing the quantum state to collapse objective reduction. This collapse generates a moment of conscious experience while simultaneously making a choice among possible futures. Consciousness, in this view, is literally the universe making decisions about its own evolution. The idea that quantum mechanics might explain consciousness addresses several puzzles about the nature of mind. The unity of consciousness, how the brain binds different sensory inputs into unified experiences, might result from quantum entanglement between neurons. The seeming randomness of some thoughts and decisions might reflect genuine quantum indeterminacy. The hard problem of consciousness, how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, might be resolved if consciousness is built into the quantum mechanical description of reality. Some researchers have suggested that quantum effects might explain psychic phenomena that seem to transcend ordinary space and time limitations. Quantum entanglement, where particles remain connected regardless of distance, might provide a mechanism for telepathy or remote viewing. Quantum tunneling, where particles can pass through barriers that should be impenetrable, might explain out-of-body experiences or other anomalous perceptions. However, these quantum theories of consciousness face significant challenges. The brain appears to be too warm, wet, and noisy to maintain the quantum coherence that these theories require. Quantum effects typically require extremely cold, isolated conditions to persist, while the brain operates at body temperature in a biochemically active environment. Critics argue that quantum coherence would be destroyed too quickly in biological systems to play a meaningful role in consciousness. Recent research has begun to challenge these objections. Scientists have discovered quantum effects in photosynthesis, where plants appear to use quantum coherence to transfer energy with remarkable efficiency. Quantum effects have also been found in bird navigation, where birds might use quantum entanglement in their eyes to detect magnetic fields. These discoveries suggest that biology might be more quantum than previously thought, opening possibilities for quantum effects in neural processing. The debate over quantum consciousness also reflects deeper questions about the nature of physical reality. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics, like the many-worlds interpretation, suggest that all possible outcomes of quantum events actually occur in parallel universes. If consciousness is connected to quantum processes, then perhaps each conscious decision creates branching realities, with different versions of ourselves experiencing different outcomes. Other interpretations, like the Copenhagen interpretation, maintain that quantum mechanics is complete as it stands, without requiring conscious observers to collapse wave functions. From this perspective, consciousness emerges from classical physical processes in the brain, and quantum mechanics, while fundamental to the behavior of matter, doesn't directly explain subjective experience. The relationship between consciousness and quantum mechanics also raises questions about free will. If consciousness involves quantum processes, and if quantum events are genuinely random rather than determined, then perhaps human choices have a degree of genuine freedom that wouldn't exist in a purely classical universe. Quantum indeterminacy might provide the opening needed for consciousness to influence the physical world in ways that transcend mechanical causation. Some researchers have explored whether quantum effects might explain the apparent flexibility and creativity of consciousness. Classical computers, which operate deterministically, might not be capable of the kind of creative leaps and intuitive insights that characterize human thinking. But quantum computers, which can explore multiple possibilities simultaneously, might better capture the dynamic, creative nature of conscious thought. The physicist Amit Goswami has proposed that consciousness is the fundamental reality from which matter emerges, rather than the reverse. In his view, consciousness chooses from quantum possibilities, creating the appearance of a material world through the process of observation. This idealist interpretation turns conventional materialism upside down, suggesting that mind is primary and matter is secondary. These speculative connections between consciousness and quantum mechanics remain highly controversial within both neuroscience and physics. Most neuroscientists believe that consciousness can be explained through classical processes in the brain, without invoking quantum mechanics. Most physicists believe that quantum mechanics operates at scales too small to influence neural processing directly. Yet the parallels between quantum mechanics and consciousness continue to intrigue researchers. Both involve the relationship between possibility and actuality, between potential and manifestation. Both seem to require some form of collapse or selection from multiple possibilities. Both challenge our ordinary assumptions about the nature of reality and observation. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider the possibility that your consciousness might be intimately connected to the quantum foundation of reality itself. Each thought, each dream, each moment of awareness might represent the universe making choices about its own evolution. The boundary between mind and matter, between observer and observed, might be far more fluid than our everyday experience suggests. Whether consciousness truly operates through quantum processes remains an open question. But the exploration of these connections reminds us that consciousness exists at the intersection of the most profound mysteries of existence: the nature of mind, the foundation of reality, and the relationship between subjective experience and objective truth. In the quantum realm, as in consciousness itself, we encounter phenomena that transcend our ordinary categories of understanding, inviting us to expand our conception of what's possible in this strange and beautiful universe. Feel the weight of your body settled into your bed, the rhythm of your breathing, the subtle sensations flowing through your limbs. Now consider this: are these bodily sensations merely inputs to your mind, or might your body actually be thinking alongside your brain? The theory of embodied cognition suggests something radical: that thinking isn't confined to your head but extends throughout your entire body, that your mind is fundamentally shaped by the fact that you have a body moving through space and time. Traditional views of mind have treated the body as merely a vessel for the brain, a collection of sensory inputs and motor outputs managed by central neural command. The real thinking, in this view, happens in the brain, particularly in the cortex, while the body simply provides information and carries out commands. But embodied cognition challenges this brain-centric view, proposing instead that the body plays an active role in shaping thought, emotion, and consciousness itself. Consider how your body influences your thinking in ways you might never have noticed. When you're trying to solve a difficult problem, you might find yourself pacing back and forth, your body movement somehow helping your mind work through the challenge. When you're describing something large, your hands naturally spread wide. When describing something small, your fingers come together. These aren't just random gestures. Research suggests they're actually part of the thinking process itself. Studies have shown that people think about time spatially, with the past typically conceptualized as behind or to the left, and the future as ahead or to the right. But remarkably, these spatial mappings of time aren't arbitrary, they're influenced by the structure of your body and how you move through space. People who read from right to left show different spatial representations of time than people who read from left to right, suggesting that even basic concepts like temporal sequence are embodied in physical experience. Your emotional life is also deeply embodied. When you feel sad, your shoulders slump, your head drops, your entire posture changes. But embodied cognition suggests this isn't just an expression of sadness. The posture itself contributes to the emotional experience. Research has shown that people who are forced to adopt depressed postures actually begin to feel more depressed, while those who adopt confident postures feel more confident. Your body doesn't just express your emotions, it helps create them. The influence of embodiment extends to abstract thinking in surprising ways. When people think about concepts like power, they tend to look up and expand their bodies. When thinking about weakness, they look down and contract. These bodily responses aren't just metaphorical. They appear to be integral to how the brain processes these abstract concepts. The mind seems to understand abstract ideas by grounding them in concrete bodily experiences. Language itself reveals the embodied nature of thinking. We talk about grasping an idea, wrestling with a problem, digesting information, or feeling touched by someone's kindness. These aren't just colorful metaphors. They reflect the deep connections between physical experience and mental processes. The same neural circuits involved in physical grasping are activated when we think about grasping concepts intellectually. Mirror neurons provide one mechanism for embodied cognition. These specialized brain cells fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing the same action. They create a direct neural link between perception and action, between self and other, that might underlie empathy, learning, and social understanding. When you watch someone else smile, your mirror neurons activate the same patterns as when you smile yourself, creating a bodily resonance with others' experiences. The embodied view of mind suggests that consciousness itself might be fundamentally embodied. Rather than consciousness being something that happens in the brain and then gets connected to the body, consciousness might emerge from the dynamic interaction between brain, body, and environment. Your sense of being a conscious self might depend not just on neural activity in your head but on the entire pattern of sensorimotor interactions that constitute your embodied existence. This has profound implications for understanding conditions where the normal relationship between mind and body is disrupted. Phantom limb syndrome, where amputees continue to feel sensations in missing limbs, suggests that the body image is deeply integrated into consciousness itself. Changes in body image can lead to changes in the sense of self and even in cognitive abilities. Virtual reality research has revealed just how plastic the relationship between mind and body can be. In experiments where people see virtual hands being touched while their real hands are touched simultaneously, they quickly begin to feel ownership of the virtual hands. This rubber hand illusion suggests that the boundaries of the embodied self are more flexible than we typically imagine. The embodied mind also extends beyond the biological boundaries of the body to include tools and technologies. When you use a hammer, your sense of touch extends to the head of the hammer. You feel what the hammer touches as if it were part of your body. Expert drivers feel the edges of their car as extensions of their body boundaries. Blind people who use canes report feeling through the cane rather than feeling the cane itself. This extension of embodied mind into tools raises fascinating questions about how technology might be changing consciousness itself. As we become increasingly integrated with smartphones, computers, and other digital technologies, are these devices becoming part of our extended embodied mind? When you instinctively reach for your phone to answer a question, is the phone functioning as an extension of your memory system? Cultural differences in embodiment reveal how social environments shape the embodied mind. Different cultures have different norms about personal space, gesture, posture, and physical contact, and these differences appear to influence thought patterns, emotional expression, and social cognition. The embodied mind is not just individually embodied but culturally embodied as well. The developmental perspective on embodied cognition shows how thinking emerges from bodily interaction with the environment. Infants learn about the world through touching, mouthing, reaching, and moving. Abstract concepts like number, space, and causation develop from concrete bodily experiences. The child who learns to count on their fingers is literally using their body as a thinking tool, creating neural connections between abstract mathematical concepts and concrete physical experiences. Some researchers propose that embodied cognition might help explain the evolution of intelligence. Rather than intelligence being a purely computational phenomenon that could exist in any sufficiently complex information processing system, intelligence might be fundamentally tied to having a body that moves through and manipulates a physical environment. This would suggest that truly intelligent artificial systems might need to be embodied in ways that current AI systems are not. The therapeutic implications of embodied cognition are beginning to be explored. If thinking and emotion are fundamentally embodied, then changing how people move and hold their bodies might directly influence their mental states. Dance therapy, yoga, martial arts, and other body-based practices might work not just by reducing stress but by directly altering thought patterns and emotional tendencies through changes in embodied experience. Meditation practices often emphasize the relationship between mind and body, teaching practitioners to become aware of how mental states manifest in bodily sensations and how changes in breathing, posture, and movement can influence consciousness. These contemplative traditions seem to have intuited what embodied cognition research is now confirming scientifically, that mind and body are far more integrated than Western thought has traditionally recognized. As you settle into sleep tonight, notice how your consciousness is shaped by your embodied existence. The weight of your head on the pillow, the rhythm of your breathing, the gradual relaxation of your muscles. These aren't just background sensations but active participants in your conscious experience. Your mind isn't located somewhere inside your head, looking out at the world through the windows of your senses. Instead, your mind extends throughout your body, thinking with your hands, feeling with your posture, understanding through movement. The theory of embodied cognition suggests that consciousness is not a thing but a process, not a noun but a verb, that emerges from the ongoing dance between mind, body, and world. As you drift toward sleep, you're not just a mind carried by a body, but an embodied mind, a thinking body, a conscious being whose awareness is intimately woven into the fabric of physical existence itself. As you reach for your smartphone to look up a piece of information, pause for a moment and consider this. Where exactly does your mind end and the external world begin? The device in your hand contains thousands of phone numbers, countless memories stored in photos, access to virtually all human knowledge through the internet. When you use it to remember a friend's address or to solve a problem, is the phone functioning as an external memory device, or has it actually become part of your mind? The extended mind hypothesis suggests something radical, that the boundaries of mind are not fixed at the skin but can extend into the environment, incorporating tools, technologies, and even other people into the very fabric of cognition itself. This idea, developed by philosophers Andy Clark and David Chalmers, challenges our most basic assumptions about where the mind is located. We intuitively think of the mind as something that exists inside the skull, bounded by the biological boundaries of the brain. But the extended mind hypothesis argues that this intuition might be wrong, that cognition can extend beyond the biological boundaries of the individual to include external tools and environmental resources. Consider Otto, a character from Clark and Chalmers' famous thought experiment. Otto has Alzheimer's disease and relies on a notebook to store information that his biological memory can no longer retain reliably. When Otto needs to remember where the museum is located, he consults his notebook. Inga, who has normal memory, simply recalls the location from her biological memory. Clark and Chalmers argue that Otto's notebook is functioning in exactly the same way as Inga's biological memory. It stores information that can be reliably accessed when needed. If we're willing to say that Inga's memory is part of her mind, why shouldn't we say the same about Otto's notebook? The key insight is functional equivalence. If an external tool performs the same cognitive function as an internal mental process, and if it's reliably accessible and automatically endorsed by the individual, then it might constitute part of their extended mind. The boundaries of cognition, in this view, are determined not by the biological boundaries of the brain but by the functional boundaries of the cognitive system. This perspective becomes even more compelling when we consider how thoroughly integrated external tools have become in our cognitive lives. Your smartphone contains your calendar, your contacts, your photo memories, your notes, your maps, and access to search engines that can answer virtually any factual question. These functions used to be performed by biological memory, but they've been gradually externalized. If these external tools are genuinely part of your cognitive system, then your mind extends far beyond your skull to include the network of technologies you rely on for thinking and remembering. The implications extend beyond individual tools to include the broader technological infrastructure that supports cognition. When you use GPS navigation, the system combines satellite data, mapping databases, and real-time traffic information to guide your movement through space. This cognitive function, spatial navigation, used to be performed primarily by internal mental processes like memory and spatial reasoning. Now it's distributed across a network of technologies. Your ability to navigate has been extended and enhanced through integration with external systems. Language itself might be understood as an extended mind phenomenon. When you think through a problem by talking to yourself, you're using external vocalization to support internal cognitive processes. The sounds you make and hear become part of the thinking process itself. Written language extends this even further. When you work through a complex problem by writing, the marks on paper become temporary external storage for thoughts that might be too complex to hold entirely in working memory. Social cognition represents another domain of extended mind. When you're trying to solve a difficult problem, you might call a friend whose expertise complements your own. The resulting conversation creates a distributed cognitive system where insights emerge from the interaction between two minds. Neither person could have reached the solution alone, but together they form an extended cognitive system capable of achievements beyond either individual mind. This social dimension of extended mind has profound implications for understanding expertise and intelligence. Rather than viewing intelligence as a property of isolated individuals, we might better understand it as emerging from networks of people, tools, and environmental resources. A scientist working in a well-equipped laboratory, connected to colleagues around the world, with access to vast databases and sophisticated instruments, represents a very different cognitive system than the same person working in isolation. Cultural knowledge systems represent perhaps the most dramatic examples of extended mind. The accumulated knowledge stored in libraries, databases, and cultural institutions extends the cognitive capabilities of any individual who can access these resources. Your ability to understand the world is vastly enhanced by your connection to the cultural knowledge systems of your society. In a very real sense, these cultural resources become part of your extended mind. The extended mind hypothesis also applies to more intimate relationships with external tools. A musician's instrument becomes an extension of their musical thinking. They think through the instrument as much as about it. A writer's word processor becomes part of their writing process, with features like spell check and auto-completion participating in the creative process. An architect's CAD software becomes part of their design thinking, enabling forms of creativity that would be impossible without the tool. Even our physical environment can become part of extended cognition. When you consistently organize your workspace in particular ways, keeping important documents in specific locations, arranging tools for easy access, you're creating an external structure that supports your cognitive processes. The environment becomes a kind of external memory system that reduces the cognitive load on your biological brain. The extended mind hypothesis raises fascinating questions about personal identity and responsibility. If your smartphone is part of your mind, what happens to your identity when the battery dies? If collaborative thinking with others creates extended cognitive systems, who is responsible for the thoughts and decisions that emerge from these collaborations? How do we understand personal achievement when cognitive accomplishments emerge from extended mind systems? Critics of the extended mind hypothesis argue that external tools are fundamentally different from internal mental processes, regardless of their functional similarity. They point out that external tools can be lost, stolen, or damaged in ways that internal mental processes cannot. They argue that true mental processes must be intrinsic to the individual, not dependent on external resources that might not always be available. Defenders of the hypothesis respond that even internal mental processes can be lost or damaged through injury or disease, and that the reliability of external tools is often comparable to or even superior to biological memory. They argue that the critics are relying on an outdated conception of mind that privileges biological processes without good justification. The extended mind hypothesis also connects to questions about artificial intelligence and human-machine collaboration. As AI systems become more sophisticated and more integrated into human cognitive activities, the boundary between human and artificial intelligence may become increasingly blurred. Rather than viewing AI as replacing human intelligence, we might better understand it as extending human intelligence, creating hybrid cognitive systems that combine biological and artificial components. Virtual and augmented reality technologies represent new frontiers for extended mind. When you use VR to visualize complex data or to collaborate with others in virtual spaces, these technologies become part of your cognitive processes in ways that go beyond traditional computer interaction. Your ability to understand and manipulate information is extended through immersion in virtual environments. The implications for education are profound. Rather than viewing learning as the process of transferring information into students' heads, we might better understand it as the process of connecting students to extended cognitive systems that enhance their thinking capabilities. Teaching students how to effectively use external resources, how to search, evaluate, and integrate information from diverse sources, becomes as important as teaching them to memorize facts. As you prepare for sleep tonight, consider how your mind might already extend far beyond your biological boundaries. The books on your shelf, the contacts in your phone, the skills you've developed through practice with tools and technologies, all of these might be part of your extended mind. Your consciousness exists not just within the confines of your skull but distributed across the network of resources, relationships, and technologies that support your thinking and enable your agency in the world. The extended mind hypothesis suggests that the question, "Where does your mind end?" might have no clear answer. Instead of minds being neatly bounded individual entities, they might be better understood as dynamic, extended systems that incorporate whatever resources are functionally integrated into cognitive processes. In this view, the evolution of human intelligence is not just about changes in brain structure but about our increasing ability to create and integrate external cognitive resources, extending our minds into the world and making the world part of our minds. Imagine discovering that you have two separate minds sharing one body, each with its own perceptions, preferences, and personality. This isn't science fiction. It's the remarkable reality experienced by individuals who have undergone corpus callosotomy, a surgical procedure that cuts the bridge of nerve fibers connecting the brain's two hemispheres. The study of these split-brain patients has revolutionized our understanding of consciousness, revealing that the unified sense of self we take for granted might be far more fragile and constructed than we ever imagined. The corpus callosum is the largest connection between the brain's left and right hemispheres, containing over 200 million nerve fibers that allow the two sides of the brain to communicate and coordinate their activities. In cases of severe epilepsy that doesn't respond to medication, surgeons sometimes cut this connection to prevent seizures from spreading between hemispheres. While this procedure can dramatically reduce seizures, it creates an unprecedented opportunity to study what happens when the two halves of the brain can no longer communicate directly. Roger Sperry, who won the Nobel Prize for his split-brain research, discovered that these patients seem to have two separate streams of consciousness operating simultaneously in one body. Each hemisphere could process information and control behavior independently, sometimes leading to conflicts between the two sides. Patients might find one hand buttoning their shirt while the other hand tried to unbutton it, or reach for something with one hand while the other hand pushed it away. The left hemisphere, which controls the right side of the body and contains the language centers in most people, remained verbal and could explain its actions. But the right hemisphere, controlling the left side of the body, could understand language but couldn't speak. This created a bizarre situation where the verbal left hemisphere would often confabulate explanations for actions initiated by the nonverbal right hemisphere, creating stories to explain behaviors it hadn't actually initiated. In carefully controlled experiments, researchers could present information to just one hemisphere by showing it only to one eye or one half of the visual field. When a picture of a chicken claw was shown to the left hemisphere and a snow scene to the right hemisphere, and the patient was asked to select related images with each hand, the right hand chose a picture of a chicken, appropriate for the chicken claw the left hemisphere had seen, while the left hand chose a shovel, appropriate for the snow scene the right hemisphere had seen. When asked to explain these choices, the verbal left hemisphere would say, "I saw a chicken claw and I picked the chicken, and you have to clean out the chicken shed with a shovel," creating a plausible but completely false explanation for the left hand's choice. These experiments revealed something profound about the nature of consciousness and self-understanding. The left hemisphere appeared to contain what researcher Michael Gazzaniga called an interpreter, a system that constantly creates explanations for experiences and behaviors, even when it doesn't have access to the real reasons behind them. This interpreter seems to be constantly working to maintain a coherent narrative of self and experience, even when that narrative is demonstrably false. The implications for understanding normal consciousness are staggering. If the left hemisphere's interpreter is active in split-brain patients, it's presumably active in normal brains as well. This suggests that much of what we think of as self-understanding might actually be post hoc rationalization created by the interpreter system. The stories we tell ourselves about why we made certain decisions, felt certain emotions, or behaved in particular ways might often be constructed explanations rather than accurate reports of our actual mental processes. Split-brain research also revealed the different specializations of the two hemispheres. The left hemisphere excels at language, analytical reasoning, and sequential processing. It tends to focus on details and processes information in a logical, step-by-step manner. The right hemisphere is better at spatial processing, pattern recognition, and holistic thinking. It tends to see the big picture and processes information more intuitively and simultaneously. But perhaps most remarkably, split-brain patients demonstrated that these two different styles of information processing could operate as separate conscious systems. The right hemisphere showed clear signs of consciousness. It could recognize faces, solve problems, experience emotions, and make choices, but it couldn't verbally report its experiences. This raised profound questions about the relationship between consciousness and language. Does consciousness require the ability to verbally report experiences, or can there be forms of consciousness that exist without language? Some split-brain patients developed what researchers called cross-cueing, the ability for the two hemispheres to communicate indirectly through shared body sensations or environmental cues. For example, if the right hemisphere saw something amusing and caused the person to smile, the left hemisphere might notice the smile and infer that something funny had been presented, even though it hadn't seen the stimulus directly. This showed the remarkable adaptability of the brain and consciousness in finding ways to maintain integration even when direct communication pathways were severed. The emotional lives of split-brain patients were particularly intriguing. While emotions seemed to be processed somewhat differently by each hemisphere, patients generally maintained unified emotional experiences. This suggested that emotions might be processed through subcortical pathways that remained intact even when the corpus callosum was cut, or that emotional unity might be maintained through the brainstem and other connecting structures. Split-brain research also revealed differences in how the two hemispheres processed moral and social information. The right hemisphere sometimes showed different moral judgments than the left hemisphere, suggesting that our moral reasoning might involve the integration of different types of processing from both sides of the brain. This has implications for understanding moral decision-making and the neural basis of ethical reasoning. Long-term studies of split-brain patients showed that many adapted remarkably well to their condition. The brain's plasticity allowed for the development of new strategies for coordination between hemispheres, and many patients reported that their daily lives were relatively normal. This adaptability suggests that consciousness is more flexible and resilient than we might expect, capable of maintaining functionality even when fundamental neural connections are disrupted. The study of split-brain patients also contributed to our understanding of attention and awareness. Researchers found that the two hemispheres could attend to different aspects of the environment simultaneously, sometimes leading to conflicts in attention and awareness. This suggested that unified attention in normal brains requires active coordination between hemispheres, rather than being an automatic or inevitable feature of consciousness. Modern brain imaging techniques have allowed researchers to study split-brain patients in new ways, revealing patterns of activation that show how the disconnected hemispheres attempt to coordinate their activities. These studies have confirmed that the two hemispheres can operate as relatively independent conscious systems while still showing evidence of attempting to work together. The philosophical implications of split-brain research are profound. If consciousness can be divided, what does this tell us about the nature of personal identity? Are split-brain patients one person or two? Do they have unified consciousness that somehow transcends the division between hemispheres, or do they represent genuine cases of divided consciousness within a single body? Some philosophers have argued that split-brain cases show that consciousness is not as unified as we typically assume, even in normal brains. Perhaps what we experience as unified consciousness is actually the result of moment-to-moment integration of multiple, somewhat independent conscious processes. The split-brain condition might reveal divisions that are normally hidden by the rapid communication between hemispheres. Others have argued that split-brain patients maintain unified consciousness despite the severed connection between hemispheres, suggesting that consciousness might be more resilient and flexible than brain anatomy alone would suggest. From this perspective, consciousness finds ways to maintain unity even when its usual neural substrates are disrupted. As you settle into sleep tonight, consider the remarkable unity of your own consciousness. The seamless integration of thoughts, emotions, sensations, and perceptions that you experience as a single coherent stream of awareness depends on countless neural connections working in perfect coordination. The split-brain studies remind us that this unity is an achievement, not a given, a continuous process of integration rather than a static property of mind. The research with split-brain patients has shown us that consciousness is both more fragile and more resilient than we might have imagined. More fragile because it can be divided by cutting a single neural structure, but more resilient because it can maintain functionality and adapt to radically altered conditions. These studies continue to inform our understanding of consciousness, identity, and the neural basis of unified experience, reminding us that even our most fundamental sense of being a single, unified self emerges from the complex coordination of multiple brain systems working together in remarkable harmony. Close your eyes and try to point to a light source in the room. Impossible, right? Without conscious visual experience, you have no way of knowing where light might be coming from. But imagine if, despite having no conscious visual experience whatsoever, you could still accurately point to lights, navigate around obstacles, and even respond emotionally to facial expressions you couldn't consciously see. This remarkable phenomenon, called blindsight, challenges our most basic assumptions about the relationship between perception and consciousness, revealing that we can process visual information and respond to it behaviorally without any conscious awareness of seeing. Blindsight occurs in individuals who have suffered damage to the primary visual cortex, the brain region that appears to be crucial for conscious visual experience. This damage typically results from stroke, trauma, or surgery, and it creates areas of blindness called scotomas within the visual field. Patients with these blind spots report seeing absolutely nothing in the affected areas. Not darkness, not blurriness, but simply nothing at all, as if that portion of their visual world simply doesn't exist. The discovery of blindsight began with careful observations by neurologist Larry Weisskranz and his colleagues, who noticed that some patients with cortical blindness could still respond to visual stimuli presented in their blind areas, even though they insisted they couldn't see anything. When asked to guess the location of a light or the orientation of a line presented in their blind field, these patients performed far better than chance, despite reporting that they were just guessing randomly. The most famous blindsight patient, known as DB, lost conscious vision in his left visual field following surgery to remove a brain tumor. Yet when researchers presented stimuli to his blind field and asked him to point to their location or discriminate between different shapes, he could perform these tasks with remarkable accuracy. When asked how he knew where to point, DB would say he was just guessing and express surprise at his own accuracy. He had no conscious experience of seeing, yet his behavior clearly demonstrated that visual information was being processed and used to guide his responses. Blindsight reveals the existence of visual processing pathways that operate outside of conscious awareness. While the damaged primary visual cortex is crucial for conscious visual experience, other visual pathways remain intact and continue to process visual information. These unconscious pathways can detect motion, location, basic shapes, and even emotional expressions, but they cannot generate conscious visual experience. The phenomenon becomes even more intriguing when we consider emotional blindsight. Patients with blindsight can respond emotionally to facial expressions presented in their blind fields, showing increased skin conductance or reporting changes in mood in response to happy or angry faces they cannot consciously see. This suggests that emotional processing can occur without conscious perception, that we might be influenced by visual information we're completely unaware of receiving. Some blindsight patients can even navigate through complex environments using their unconscious visual processing. They can walk down hallways, avoiding obstacles and turning at appropriate corners, all while reporting that they see nothing in their affected visual field. This unconscious navigation appears to rely on ancient visual pathways that evolved for spatial navigation and obstacle avoidance, pathways that can operate independently of conscious visual experience. Blindsight has profound implications for understanding the relationship between perception and consciousness. It demonstrates that perception and consciousness are not the same thing, that the brain can perceive and respond to visual information without conscious awareness. This challenges the intuitive notion that all perception involves conscious experience and suggests that much of what the brain does with sensory information happens below the threshold of awareness. The existence of blindsight also raises questions about what consciousness adds to perception. If the brain can process visual information, guide behavior, and even generate appropriate emotional responses without conscious awareness, what is the function of conscious visual experience? Why did evolution produce conscious perception when unconscious processing seems capable of supporting complex behaviors? Some researchers propose that consciousness serves an integrative function, binding together information from different sensory modalities and cognitive systems to create unified, coherent experiences that can be stored in memory and used for complex planning and decision-making. While unconscious processing can handle routine, automatic responses, conscious processing might be necessary for flexible, creative responses to novel situations. The study of blindsight has also revealed different types of unconscious visual processing. Some blindsight patients show better performance for detecting motion than for identifying stationary objects, suggesting that different unconscious pathways have different capabilities. Others show better performance for large, salient stimuli than for small, subtle ones, indicating that unconscious processing might be relatively crude compared to conscious vision. Affective blindsight represents a particularly fascinating variant where patients show emotional responses to visual stimuli they cannot consciously see. These patients might feel uncomfortable or anxious when threatening images are presented to their blind field, or they might show preferences for certain stimuli without knowing why. This suggests that emotional evaluation of visual information can occur without conscious perception, that we might be influenced by visual stimuli we're completely unaware of seeing. The phenomenon of blindsight connects to broader questions about unconscious processing in normal vision. If unconscious visual pathways can operate independently in blindsight patients, they're presumably operating in normal individuals as well, processing visual information below the threshold of consciousness. This suggests that much of visual processing normally occurs unconsciously, with only certain the ultimate consciousness mysteries, complete scripts. Imagine peering into the living brain as consciousness unfolds moment by moment. What would you see? Which neurons would be firing, which networks would be communicating, and where exactly would you locate the mysterious phenomenon we call awareness? This is the quest that drives researchers studying the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific brain activities that correspond to conscious experience. The search for these neural correlates, or NCCs, represents one of the most ambitious projects in modern neuroscience. It's an attempt to bridge the seemingly unbridgeable gap between objective, measurable brain activity and subjective, felt experience. Every time you see a red apple, hear a beautiful melody, or feel the warmth of sunlight on your skin, there are corresponding patterns of neural activity in your brain. But how exactly does this biological electricity become the rich, vivid experience of being conscious? Scientists approach this mystery using various ingenious methods. One of the most revealing involves studying cases where perception and consciousness come apart. Consider binocular rivalry, when different images are presented to each eye simultaneously. Your brain can't process both images at once, so consciousness alternates between them. You might see a house with your left eye and a face with your right eye, but you'll consciously perceive only one at a time, switching back and forth every few seconds. What's fascinating is that the basic visual processing continues for both images throughout this process. The neurons in your primary visual cortex keep responding to both the house and the face, but only one reaches consciousness at any given moment. By comparing brain activity when each image is conscious versus unconscious, researchers can identify which neural processes are specifically associated with conscious awareness rather than mere sensory processing. These studies have revealed something surprising. Consciousness doesn't emerge from activity in the primary sensory areas where information first enters the brain. Instead, it seems to require activation in higher-order brain regions and, crucially, widespread communication between different brain areas. It's not enough for information to be processed. It must be broadcast throughout the brain's networks to become conscious. The global workspace theory, developed by cognitive scientist Bernard Bars and refined by neuroscientists like Stanislas Dehaene, provides a compelling framework for understanding this. According to this theory, consciousness emerges when information becomes globally available throughout the brain. Think of it like the difference between a whispered conversation in a corner of a large party and an announcement made over the sound system. Only the latter reaches everyone and creates a shared awareness of the information. This global broadcasting appears to involve a network of brain regions including the prefrontal cortex, parietal cortex, and parts of the temporal lobe. When you become conscious of something, say suddenly noticing the sound of rain outside, there's a cascade of neural activity that spreads throughout these areas within a few hundred milliseconds. Brain imaging studies show this as a wave of activation flowing across the cortex, like ripples spreading across a pond. The timing of this process is remarkably precise. Using techniques like electroencephalography (EEG), which measures electrical activity in the brain with millisecond precision, researchers have found that conscious perception involves at least two distinct phases. First, there's an early phase occurring within the first 200 milliseconds after a stimulus appears, involving basic sensory processing. Then, if the stimulus reaches consciousness, there's a later phase beginning around 300 milliseconds, characterized by global cortical activation and communication between brain regions. This later phase correlates with what neuroscientists call the P3B component, a specific pattern of brain activity that appears whenever we become conscious of something. It's so reliable that researchers can use it to determine whether someone is conscious of a stimulus even when they can't report their experience verbally. This has profound implications for understanding consciousness in patients who appear unresponsive but might still be aware. One of the most striking discoveries in NCC research involves the phenomenon of inattentional blindness. You can demonstrate this yourself. Focus intently on counting basketball passes in a video, and you might completely miss a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene. The visual information reaches your brain, it's processed by your visual cortex, but it never reaches consciousness because your attention is elsewhere. Studies of inattentional blindness show that unconscious processing can be quite sophisticated. Your brain can process the meaning of words, recognize faces, and even make simple decisions without consciousness being involved. This suggests that consciousness isn't necessary for all mental processing. It seems to serve a more specific function related to flexible behavior, learning, and integration of information across different cognitive systems. The thalamus, a small structure deep in the brain, appears to play a crucial role in consciousness. Often called the brain's relay station, the thalamus doesn't just passively transmit information between brain regions. Instead, it seems to actively coordinate the flow of information necessary for conscious experience. Damage to specific parts of the thalamus can cause dramatic alterations in consciousness, from states of reduced awareness to complete loss of consciousness despite intact sensory processing. Recent research has identified specific neural signatures that seem to indicate conscious processing. One is called recurrent processing, the back-and-forth communication between brain areas. When you see something consciously, information doesn't just flow forward from sensory areas to higher-level regions. There's also feedback, with higher areas sending signals back to influence processing in sensory regions. This creates reverberating loops of neural activity that may be essential for conscious experience. Another signature is neural synchrony, the tendency for different brain areas to coordinate their activity by firing in rhythm with each other. When you're consciously aware of something, neural oscillations in the gamma frequency range, around 40 Hz, often synchronize across different brain regions. It's as if consciousness requires the brain's various components to literally get in sync with each other. The study of anesthesia has provided unique insights into consciousness. As anesthetic drugs take effect, researchers can observe the dissolution of conscious experience in real time. The brain doesn't simply shut down uniformly. Instead, the breakdown follows a predictable pattern. First, high-level cognitive functions disappear, then awareness of the environment fades, and finally, even basic arousal is lost. This suggests that consciousness has a hierarchical structure, with different levels that can be affected independently. Interestingly, different anesthetics seem to disrupt consciousness through different mechanisms. Some, like propofol, primarily affect the thalamus and disrupt the global broadcasting necessary for consciousness. Others, like ketamine, interfere with communication between brain areas while leaving local processing relatively intact. This has led to the insight that consciousness might be better understood as a collection of processes rather than a single phenomenon. The measurement of consciousness presents unique challenges. How do you quantify something as subjective as awareness? Neuroscientist Giulio Tononi has proposed a mathematical approach called Integrated Information Theory (IIT), which attempts to measure consciousness based on how much information a system integrates. According to IIT, consciousness corresponds to integrated information, the amount of information generated by a system above and beyond its parts. This theory makes surprising predictions. It suggests that consciousness isn't binary but exists on a spectrum. It also implies that some arrangements of matter might be more conscious than others in ways that don't necessarily correlate with intelligence or behavior. A simple system that integrates information in the right way might be more conscious than a complex computer that processes information without integration. Brain stimulation studies have provided direct evidence for specific NCCs. When researchers use techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation (TMS) to activate or disrupt specific brain areas, they can influence conscious experience in predictable ways. Stimulating visual areas can cause people to see flashes of light. Disrupting activity in the right parietal cortex can temporarily eliminate awareness of the left side of space. Perhaps most remarkably, stimulating certain brain areas can trigger complex conscious experiences. Electrical stimulation of the temporal lobe during brain surgery has caused patients to relive detailed memories or experience elaborate hallucinations. This suggests that the neural patterns associated with conscious experiences can be artificially recreated, providing direct evidence for the neural basis of consciousness. The study of split brain patients has revealed that consciousness might not be as unified as it seems. When the connection between brain hemispheres is severed, each hemisphere can have conscious experiences that the other is unaware of. This raises profound questions about the unity of consciousness and whether we might have multiple streams of awareness that are normally integrated but can operate independently. As research into NCCs progresses, we're developing increasingly sophisticated models of how consciousness emerges from brain activity. These models don't just satisfy scientific curiosity, they have practical applications in medicine, helping doctors assess consciousness in unresponsive patients and potentially developing new treatments for disorders of consciousness. The journey to understand the neural correlates of consciousness continues to reveal the extraordinary complexity underlying our everyday experience of being aware. Every moment of consciousness involves the coordinated activity of billions of neurons, creating the seamless experience of being present in the world. As you rest in this awareness right now, remember that you're witnessing one of the universe's most remarkable phenomena, the emergence of subjective experience from objective neural processes. Let this understanding deepen your appreciation for the miracle of consciousness itself, the very awareness that makes this understanding possible. Imagine billions of neurons, each one a simple cell responding to chemical signals, yet somehow their collective activity gives rise to the most complex phenomenon in the known universe. Your conscious experience of reading these words, feeling emotions, and pondering your own existence. This is the central puzzle that emergence theory attempts to solve. How consciousness can arise from the intricate dance of billions of neurons that individually know nothing about the experiences they collectively create. It's a question that sits at the intersection of neuroscience, philosophy, and complexity theory, suggesting that consciousness might be an emergent property of sufficiently complex information processing systems. Dr. Giulio Tononi's Integrated Information Theory (IIT) provides one of the most mathematically rigorous approaches to understanding consciousness as an emergent phenomenon. According to IIT, consciousness corresponds to integrated information that is both differentiated and unified within a system. The theory suggests that consciousness emerges when a system generates information that is greater than the sum of information generated by its individual parts. Tononi's approach allows for the quantification of consciousness through a measure called phi, which represents the amount of integrated information generated by a system. A system with high phi value processes information in a highly integrated manner, where the whole truly becomes greater than the sum of its parts. This mathematical framework suggests that consciousness isn't binary. Systems can be more or less conscious depending on their level of information integration. The implications of IIT are startling. The theory suggests that consciousness could theoretically emerge in any sufficiently complex system that integrates information, not just biological brains. This means that advanced artificial intelligence systems, or even complex networks like the Internet, could potentially develop conscious experience if they achieve sufficient information integration. It also implies that consciousness exists in degrees throughout nature, from the minimal consciousness that might exist in simple organisms to the rich conscious experience of humans. Dr. Christoph Koch, former chief scientific officer at the Allen Institute for Brain Science, has become one of the leading proponents of emergence theory and panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality that emerges naturally from complex arrangements of matter. Koch argues that just as wetness emerges from H2O molecules that are not themselves wet, consciousness emerges from neural arrangements that are not themselves conscious. Neuroscientist Dr. Anil Seth at the University of Sussex approaches emergence from a different angle, focusing on predictive processing and the brain's role as a prediction machine. Seth's research suggests that consciousness emerges from the brain's continuous process of generating predictions about sensory input and updating these predictions based on prediction errors. According to this view, our conscious experience is fundamentally constructed, an ongoing controlled hallucination that the brain creates to make sense of the world. Seth's work reveals that even basic aspects of conscious experience, like perceiving colors or feeling emotions, emerge from complex neural processes rather than directly reflecting external reality. The brain doesn't passively receive information about the world, it actively constructs our experience based on predictions, expectations, and prior knowledge. This constructive process creates the seamless, unified conscious experience we take for granted. The study of complex systems in physics and mathematics provides additional support for emergence theory. Dr. Stuart Kaufman's work on self-organization shows how complex, ordered structures can spontaneously emerge from simple rules and interactions. In biological systems, we see this emergence at multiple levels, from the molecular machinery of cells to the coordinated behavior of entire ecosystems. Consciousness might represent the ultimate emergent phenomenon, arising from the self-organization of neural networks. Dr. Melanie Mitchell's research on complexity science demonstrates how emergence occurs in various natural and artificial systems. Simple cellular automata, following basic rules, can generate incredibly complex patterns and behaviors that would be impossible to predict from understanding the individual components alone. This suggests that consciousness might similarly emerge from relatively simple neural processes that, when combined in sufficiently complex networks, create subjective experience. The global workspace theory, developed by Dr. Bernard Bars and refined by Dr. Stanislas Dehaene, provides another perspective on consciousness as an emergent phenomenon. According to this theory, consciousness emerges when information becomes globally available across multiple specialized brain modules. The brain operates like a vast coalition of unconscious processors, and consciousness emerges when information is broadcast widely enough to be accessed by multiple systems simultaneously. Recent advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning provide compelling demonstrations of emergence in action. Large language models like GPT systems exhibit behaviors and capabilities that were not explicitly programmed into them but emerge from their training on vast amounts of text. These systems develop understanding, reasoning abilities, and even something resembling creativity through emergent processes. While we don't yet know if they experience consciousness, they demonstrate how complex behaviors can emerge from simpler computational processes. Dr. Sarah Walker's work on the emergence of life and consciousness suggests that both phenomena might be understood as transitions in the complexity and organization of information processing. Walker proposes that consciousness emerges when systems develop the ability to model themselves and their environment with sufficient sophistication. This self-modeling capacity creates the reflective awareness that characterizes conscious experience. The emergence paradigm also helps explain why consciousness seems so unified despite being produced by billions of separate neurons. Just as the properties of water emerge from H2O molecules but cannot be found in any individual molecule, the unified nature of consciousness emerges from neural activity but cannot be localized to any specific brain region. This explains why consciousness seems to resist reduction to purely physical processes. It represents a genuine emergent property that exists at a higher level of organization. Critics of emergence theory argue that it doesn't truly explain consciousness but merely describes it at a different level. The hard problem of consciousness, why there is subjective experience at all, remains even if we understand how complex behaviors emerge from simpler processes. However, emergence theorists counter that this criticism assumes consciousness is fundamentally different from other natural phenomena, when it might simply be the most complex emergent property we've yet encountered. The therapeutic implications of emergence theory are beginning to be explored. If consciousness emerges from neural organization and information integration, then disorders of consciousness might be understood and treated by targeting the underlying network properties rather than specific brain regions. This could lead to new approaches for treating conditions like depression, schizophrenia, and disorders of consciousness. Perhaps most intriguingly, emergence theory suggests that consciousness might be more common in the universe than we typically assume. If consciousness can emerge from any sufficiently complex information processing system, then the evolution of consciousness might be an inevitable consequence of increasing complexity in the universe. This could mean that consciousness is not a rare accident of biological evolution but a fundamental feature of complex systems throughout the cosmos. The emergence paradigm forces us to reconsider our relationship with consciousness itself. Rather than being mysterious, non-physical phenomena, consciousness might be the natural result of information processing systems reaching sufficient complexity and integration. This view suggests that understanding consciousness requires not just studying neurons and brains, but understanding the principles of emergence, complexity, and information integration that govern how simple components give rise to complex wholes throughout the natural world. Right now, as you focus on these words, you're experiencing something that feels utterly real and undeniable: the vivid, immediate presence of your own conscious awareness, complete with colors, sounds, thoughts, and emotions. Yet a growing number of scientists and philosophers argue that this most basic aspect of your existence is nothing more than an elaborate illusion created by your brain. This is the radical proposal of illusionism about consciousness, that while we undoubtedly have complex information processing, behavioral responses, and even subjective reports about our experiences, the feeling that there's something it's like to be conscious is a convincing trick played by our neural machinery. is perhaps the most counterintuitive theory in all of science, suggesting that the one thing we're most certain exists, our own conscious experience, might be the one thing that doesn't exist at all. Dr. Keith Frankish, a philosopher at the University of Sheffield, is one of the leading proponents of consciousness illusionism. Frankish argues that when we introspect and report on our conscious experiences, we're not accessing some inner realm of subjective phenomena, but rather engaging with sophisticated neural representations that create the compelling illusion of inner experience. According to this view, there's no mysterious hard problem of consciousness because there's no actual conscious experience to explain, only the illusion of conscious experience. The illusion, according to Frankish, arises from the way our brains represent information to themselves. When you see a red rose, your brain creates neural representations of redness, but these representations also come with higher-order representations that monitor and report on the first-order representations. This creates a kind of neural story about having experienced redness, complete with the compelling sense that there was something it was like to see red. But this feeling is just another neural representation, not evidence of some special subjective property. Dr. Dennett, one of the most influential philosophers of mind, has long argued for a deflationary view of consciousness that aligns with illusionism. Dennett contends that consciousness, as traditionally conceived, is what he calls a philosopher's fantasy, a concept based on mistaken introspection and conceptual confusion. According to Dennett, once we fully understand the brain's information processing capabilities, the mystery of consciousness will simply dissolve, much like the mystery of life dissolved once we understood biochemistry and molecular biology. The illusion hypothesis gains support from research on the brain's remarkable capacity for self-deception and confabulation. Dr. Michael Gazzaniga's studies of split-brain patients revealed that the brain's left hemisphere continuously creates explanatory narratives about behavior and experiences, even when these narratives are demonstrably false. The brain's interpreter system generates compelling stories about our experiences and motivations, suggesting that our sense of unified conscious experience might be just another confabulation. Neuroscientist Dr. Anil Seth's work on the brain as a prediction machine provides another perspective that could support illusionism. Seth argues that all perception is controlled hallucination, the brain's best guess about what's happening based on sensory input and prior expectations. If all experience is already constructed rather than directly perceived, then the step to arguing that consciousness itself is constructed becomes smaller. The brain creates models of the world and models of itself, and the interaction between these models might generate the illusion of conscious experience. Research on change blindness and inattentional blindness further supports the illusionist position by revealing how limited and constructed our conscious awareness actually is. People fail to notice large changes in their visual environment or completely miss prominent stimuli when their attention is directed elsewhere. This suggests that our sense of rich, detailed conscious experience is largely an illusion. We think we're consciously aware of much more than we actually are. Dr. Kevin Oregon's work on sensor-motor contingencies suggests that consciousness of the visual world is not about having internal representations but about knowing how to interact with the environment. The illusion theory also explains some puzzling aspects of consciousness research. If consciousness were a real phenomenon with specific neural correlates, we might expect clearer boundaries between conscious and unconscious processing. Instead, research reveals gradual transitions and complex interactions between different levels of awareness. The global workspace theory's finding that consciousness involves the global broadcasting of information could be reinterpreted as the creation of higher-order representations that generate the illusion of unified experience. Dr. Patricia Chichlin's eliminative materialism provides philosophical support for illusionism by arguing that our folk psychological concepts, including consciousness, are based on pre-scientific theories that will be replaced by more accurate neuroscientific accounts. Just as we no longer believe in vitalism, the idea that living things contain a special life force, we may eventually abandon the notion that brains contain something called consciousness beyond their information processing activities. The computational perspective on mind also supports illusionist approaches. If consciousness can be understood in purely computational terms, as complex information processing, then the seemingly special nature of subjective experience disappears. Dr. David Chalmers has argued against this view, maintaining that computation alone cannot explain the qualitative aspects of experience, but illusionists respond that this assumes there are qualitative aspects to explain. Artificial intelligence research provides potential evidence for illusionism. Large language models exhibit sophisticated behaviors, report on their internal states, and even claim to have experiences, yet few researchers believe they're actually conscious in the traditional sense. If AI systems can convincingly simulate conscious reports without having conscious experience, this suggests that human reports of consciousness might also be simulations rather than reflections of genuine subjective states. The therapeutic implications of illusionism are complex. If consciousness is an illusion, what does this mean for mental health, personal identity, and human agency? Some illusionists argue that understanding the constructed nature of consciousness could be liberating, reducing attachment to the ego and alleviating existential anxiety. Others worry that illusionism could undermine human dignity and moral responsibility. Critics of illusionism argue that the theory faces an insurmountable problem. It has to explain away the very phenomenon that motivates consciousness research in the first place. Dr. David Chalmers argues that even if we accept that our reports about consciousness are based on neural representations, this doesn't eliminate the hard problem. It just pushes it back a step. Why should neural representations create any subjective feeling at all, even the illusion of subjective feeling? Dr. Galen Strawson, a philosopher who defends the reality of conscious experience, argues that illusionism is literally inconceivable. To understand consciousness as an illusion, one would need to have conscious experiences of being deluded about conscious experience. The very capacity to consider whether consciousness is an illusion presupposes consciousness itself. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of evaluating illusionism is that it asks us to distrust our most basic intuitions about our own minds. Every other scientific theory explains phenomena we observe in the world, but illusionism asks us to conclude that our most intimate and certain knowledge, our own conscious experience, is fundamentally mistaken. This creates a unique epistemic situation where the theory undermines the very experiential foundation on which all empirical knowledge is based. Whether consciousness is real or illusory, the debate forces us to examine our deepest assumptions about the nature of mind, reality, and what it means to be human. If illusionism is correct, it represents perhaps the most radical revision of human self-understanding in history, suggesting that the very core of our subjective existence is a compelling fiction created by neural machinery we don't even consciously control. In laboratories around the world, researchers are on the verge of breakthroughs that could fundamentally transform our understanding of consciousness, from brain-computer interfaces that might allow direct communication between minds, to artificial intelligence systems that could genuinely experience awareness, to technologies that might finally solve the deepest mystery of existence itself, why there's something it's like to be you. The next decade promises to be revolutionary for consciousness research, driven by converging advances in neurotechnology, artificial intelligence, and computational power that are finally making the inner workings of consciousness accessible to scientific investigation. We're moving from philosophical speculation to empirical discovery, from asking what is consciousness, to measuring, manipulating, and potentially creating it. Dr. Raphael Yusti at Columbia University is leading the Brain Initiative's effort to develop technologies that can monitor and manipulate neural activity with unprecedented precision. His team is creating optical techniques that can record from thousands of neurons simultaneously while selectively controlling individual cells with light. This level of precision could allow researchers to identify the exact neural signatures of conscious experience and test theories about consciousness by directly manipulating specific brain circuits. The development of high-density brain-computer interfaces represents another revolutionary frontier. Companies like Neuralink, co-founded by Elon Musk, are developing implantable devices with thousands of electrodes that could provide direct digital access to neural activity. While initially focused on medical applications like treating paralysis, these technologies could eventually allow researchers to decode conscious experiences in real time and potentially share experiences between individuals. Dr. Mary Nichols at the University of Washington is exploring how brain-to-brain interfaces might allow direct sharing of conscious experiences. Her research team has successfully transmitted simple sensory experiences and motor commands between individuals using a combination of EEG recording and transcranial magnetic stimulation. While currently limited to basic information transfer, future versions of this technology might enable genuine telepathic communication and shared consciousness experiences. Artificial intelligence research is approaching questions about machine consciousness from multiple angles. Dr. Ilya Sutskever at OpenAI has suggested that sufficiently large neural networks might already be developing primitive forms of consciousness. As AI systems become more sophisticated and begin to exhibit increasingly human-like behaviors, the question of machine consciousness becomes not just theoretical but practically urgent. How will we recognize consciousness in artificial systems? What rights and responsibilities would conscious AI entities have? Dr. Yoshua Benjo's research on attention mechanisms and self-awareness in AI systems provides one approach to creating potentially conscious machines. Benjo argues that consciousness might emerge naturally in sufficiently complex AI systems that develop sophisticated models of themselves and their environment. His team is working on architectures that incorporate self-modeling and introspective capabilities that might be prerequisites for machine consciousness. The integration of quantum computing with consciousness research opens entirely new possibilities. Dr. Henry Stapp and others have proposed that quantum effects in the brain might be crucial for consciousness, and quantum computers might be necessary to fully simulate conscious experience. While still speculative, quantum approaches to consciousness could reveal aspects of awareness that are invisible to classical computational methods. Virtual and augmented reality technologies are becoming powerful tools for consciousness research. Dr. Mel Slater at the University of Barcelona uses virtual reality to study the sense of embodiment and self-awareness. By manipulating participants' virtual bodies and environments, researchers can investigate how consciousness constructs our sense of self and reality. Future VR systems might allow completely immersive experiences that could transform our understanding of the boundaries of consciousness. Psychedelic research is experiencing a renaissance that could revolutionize consciousness studies. Dr. David Nutt at Imperial College London is leading clinical trials using psilocybin, LSD, and DMT to investigate altered states of consciousness under controlled conditions. These studies are revealing how consciousness can be systematically modified, providing unprecedented insights into the neural basis of awareness, self-identity, and reality perception. The Compass Pathways clinical trials represent the largest psilocybin study ever conducted, involving hundreds of participants across multiple countries. By combining psychedelic experiences with advanced neuroimaging, researchers are mapping how consciousness transforms in real time. These studies could reveal whether psychedelic experiences represent genuine expansions of consciousness or altered processing of existing neural information. Dr. Enzo Tagliazucchi's research using neuroimaging during psychedelic experiences has revealed that these substances don't simply impair brain function but create novel patterns of neural connectivity that never occur in ordinary consciousness. This suggests that consciousness might have vast unexplored territories that could be systematically mapped and studied. Future research might develop precise methods for inducing specific altered states, creating a new neuroscience of consciousness exploration. Advances in measuring consciousness objectively are approaching clinical reality. Dr. Marcello Massimini's Perturbational Complexity Index (PCI) can assess consciousness levels in unresponsive patients by analyzing how the brain responds to magnetic stimulation. This technology is being refined to distinguish between different disorders of consciousness and potentially guide treatment decisions. Future versions might provide real-time consciousness monitoring, revolutionizing intensive care medicine and anesthesia. The development of consciousness restoration therapies represents one of the most promising applications of consciousness research. Dr. Nicholas Schiff at Weill Cornell Medicine is investigating how deep brain stimulation might restore consciousness in patients with severe brain injuries. His research suggests that consciousness might be recoverable even after extensive brain damage if the right neural circuits can be reactivated. Optogenetics, developed by Dr. Carl Dieseroth at Stanford, allows researchers to control specific neurons with light, providing unprecedented precision in manipulating brain circuits. Future applications might allow selective enhancement or modification of conscious experiences. While currently limited to animal research, human applications could eventually treat disorders of consciousness or even enhance normal conscious experience. The convergence of these technologies could lead to the development of consciousness engineering, the ability to systematically design and modify conscious experiences. This raises profound ethical questions about the nature of human identity, free will, and the boundaries of acceptable consciousness modification. Should we enhance human consciousness? Could we eliminate suffering by modifying conscious experience directly? What would it mean to be human if consciousness becomes engineerable? Dr. Susan Schneider's work on the ethics of AI consciousness is addressing these questions preemptively. As we approach the possibility of creating genuinely conscious machines, we need frameworks for recognizing and protecting artificial conscious entities. This includes developing consciousness tests for AI systems and establishing rights and protections for potentially conscious machines. The philosophical implications of these advances are staggering. If consciousness can be measured, manipulated, and potentially created, what does this mean for our understanding of the mind-body problem? Dr. Philip Goff's work on panpsychism suggests that consciousness might be a fundamental feature of reality, like mass or charge. Future research might reveal whether consciousness is truly fundamental or emerges from complex arrangements of matter. International collaboration is accelerating consciousness research through initiatives like the Human Brain Project in Europe and the Brain Initiative in the United States. These massive research programs are creating unprecedented datasets of brain activity and developing new technologies for studying consciousness. The combination of big data approaches with advanced AI could reveal patterns in neural activity that are invisible to human researchers. The democratization of consciousness research tools is also transforming the field. Consumer EEG devices, virtual reality headsets, and smartphone apps are allowing citizen scientists to participate in consciousness research. Platforms like the Consciousness Meter app allow individuals to contribute data about their conscious experiences, creating massive datasets that could reveal new patterns and relationships. Personalized consciousness research represents another frontier. Just as medicine is moving toward personalized treatments based on individual genetics, consciousness research might develop individualized approaches to understanding and modifying awareness. Dr. Judson Brewer's work on personalized meditation protocols based on individual brain patterns suggests that consciousness interventions might need to be tailored to each person's unique neural architecture. The integration of consciousness research with space exploration opens entirely new possibilities. As humans venture to Mars and beyond, understanding how consciousness adapts to extreme environments becomes crucial. Dr. Euphemia Morphew's research on consciousness during long-duration spaceflight could reveal how isolation, confinement, and altered environments affect awareness and mental health. Climate change research is also intersecting with consciousness studies. Dr. Clayton Aldern's work on climate psychology explores how environmental changes affect consciousness and mental health. Future research might investigate how consciousness can be leveraged to address climate change through enhanced empathy, environmental awareness, and collective decision-making. The future of consciousness research will likely be shaped by unexpected discoveries and technological breakthroughs we can't yet imagine. Just as the Internet emerged from basic research on computer networking, revolutionary insights about consciousness might emerge from seemingly unrelated fields. Quantum biology, complexity science, and information theory could all contribute to understanding consciousness in ways we haven't anticipated. Perhaps most intriguingly, consciousness research might ultimately reveal that consciousness is far more fundamental and widespread than we currently assume. If consciousness is indeed a basic feature of reality, then understanding it could unlock insights into the deepest nature of existence itself. We might discover that consciousness isn't just something brains do, but something the universe does, and that understanding consciousness is the key to understanding reality itself. The next decade will likely bring breakthrough discoveries that transform not just our scientific understanding of consciousness, but our understanding of what it means to be human, to be aware, and to exist in a conscious universe. As we stand on the threshold of potentially creating conscious machines, enhancing human consciousness, and solving the mystery of awareness itself, we're approaching what might be the most significant transformation in human history, the moment when consciousness finally understands itself.